Under the rain, an old man was reminiscing about a soul collector. A month earlier, he had seen this scene with his own eyes when he was still a simple farmer. A knight appeared, wielding a power different from regular magic, known as ether. He was called the Chosen One because of this unusual energy. The presence of a knight brought fear to everyone nearby at that moment. No one could imitate the movements of someone who wielded ether in battle. Before the sword of that knight, everyone seemed like pieces of cheese ready to be sliced. Despite this, no one ran, as there was no reason to do so. Lord Jackson and his 7 chosen knights were known as the Black Mist Cavalry. They were the only ones capable of defeating even more powerful knights. The second in command, Lord Nell, stood out the most. This man turned an incredible fight into something that seemed completely ordinary. His opponent was a soul collector, but not for a moment did Nell think he could lose. That is, until the knight cut him into pieces. No one believed what happened in a fraction of a second. At that time, the soul collector said something the old man never forgot. He said he had extended his lifespan enough, and that he would use 1,000 hours, asking for strength from his war god, Lam. Then, the impossible happened. The entire Black Mist Cavalry was massacred in less than 30 seconds. The villagers saw this and retreated. Looking back, they saw the knight kneeling, observing them intently. It was as if he was saying it wasn't enough. The old man was interrupted before finishing his thought. A hooded man asked if, before fighting, all the man did was call upon the war god. With a blank expression, the old man replied that he didn't know about that. The hooded man tossed a few gold coins, and the old man thanked him. But he said he still hadn't told the name of the war god. The hooded man replied that he already knew. Louis Del Rossi, or Soul Collector. That name had become quite famous recently. He ended the conversation, assuming the man celebrated the end of the battle. At the tavern, a man was sitting alone at a table. He watched the storyteller while complaining that it wasn't enough. He said his lifespan wasn't long enough. That man had about 1.5 months to live. That was the time he had left. But it didn't matter. It was better than living as a Manhuas. In real life, he had been a hospital patient, destined to die without doing anything. He used his last wish to be born into a healthy body. His wish was granted, if a god even existed. In that medieval fantasy world, the man complained. He could have been in a better story. But the only way to extend his life was to kill peasants. He would need to kill 180 to live for a year. Considering travel and rest, if he killed only 9, he would be safe. However, this idea seemed impossible, as he wasn't a prodigious killer. His thoughts were interrupted when a man greeted him. He asked why the boy looked so serious. Louis asked if he was already drunk, but the man replied that he didn't know when he would die, so he should drink whenever he had the chance. The conversation was interrupted by someone referred to as the leader. He said Louis was also having fun. There was no point in being grumpy during the celebration. Louis's companions asked how he had killed so many men. The leader was also curious, as those men were much more skilled, especially Nell, who was considered a master. Louis simply said he was lucky in that, compared to their reputations, they were nothing special. The leader replied that he wasn't an idiot, and it wasn't a matter of luck. There were 4 people in that group who had been Nell's victims. Nell wasn't someone who could be defeated with mere luck. He asked if Louis was hiding something. With a disinterested look, the boy said he was joking. The secret was fighting with his life entirely at risk. His companions insulted Louis for the joke. Louis asked them to respect his privacy. The banter among friends was interrupted by a man who was the true leader of the mercenary group, Tehran the lumberjack. Tehran wanted to speak with Louis alone. The companions told Louis to return before the beer ran out. The boy replied that they were too harsh and questioned what had happened to friendship. When they saw Louis enter the leader's room, one of the companions ordered that they gather all the men who had ever been knights. When asked why, he said it was time to work. Something was bothering him. Louis was welcomed with happiness during the meeting with the chief. He was congratulated for his hard work in the battle, and praised for how a clumsy individual had become such a skilled soldier. Tehran ordered Louis to sit and asked if he remembered when he first joined the group. Louis asked him to get straight to the point, as he had never disobeyed the chief's orders. But Tehran insisted they celebrate first before moving forward. He handed Louis a glass and explained it was a new brand of alcohol that had recently emerged. Louis thanked him for the drink. The chief continued thanking Louis for his actions, stating that Viscount Bior had declared surrender. Although it had never been officially resolved, the Viscount demanded compensation for the battle. Not long before, he had approached the group's employer. Louis remarked that it seemed like he was seeking another fight. Tehran agreed, explaining that the Viscount would not pay the compensation and would instead try to kill everyone. It was terrible, but it was in their hands now. That was why Tehran needed Louis to attend the secret meeting to protect the Viscount. Louis asked why he was chosen to be the bodyguard. Tehran explained it was for appearances, as the Viscount would feel safer traveling with Louis. Tehran handed a small map to the knight. It marked the location of the meeting. It wasn't much, but he promised Louis a reward, who then stood up and went to the door, saying they would discuss the reward later. The other members were waiting for him. Tehran cheerfully bid him farewell. As Lewis walked, he reflected on how he was fighting on the battlefield like a dog, merely to survive. While the nobles sat comfortably, using commoners as disposable pawns in war, he felt increasingly distant from their world. It had been 10 years since Lewis entered this life, but he still wasn't accustomed to killing so easily. He knew he shouldn't dwell on it too much. It was then that he wondered if the shadowy figure following him in the night was Viscount Bior. Suddenly, several men appeared around him. Cautiously, Lewis asked if it was an ambush. It reminded him of a bad memory. The mercenary observed their uniforms and deduced they were knights under Bior's command. He asked if they were there to avenge their fallen comrades, but he didn't care much. Killing knights would prolong his life more than killing peasants, and he intended to resolve this quickly. Lewis imbued electricity into his sword but began coughing up blood. He asked what was happening. He had only tried to use ether, but his body wasn't responding. This had never happened before. Perhaps it was due to the drink he had earlier. Nevertheless, Lewis swung his sword but was struck before he could react. He reasoned that if the drink was poisoned, his colleagues were also in danger. But before he could take any action, Lewis was pierced by 2 knights. Lying on the ground, he thought he needed to hurry. One of the knights spoke, commenting that this was expected of the infamous soul collector. The knight then revealed his face. They were his companions, who had also drunk the same beverage. They asked Lewis not to resent them, as they didn't enjoy doing this but were being forced. Still in disbelief, Lewis asked if they had all joined Viscount Bior and were trying to kill him for the reward. He stood up, questioning if that was why they had poisoned his drink. Before he could say more about Tehran, he was interrupted by one of the knights. This knight explained that the sole person responsible for planning everything and poisoning the drink was Tehran. Lewis was shocked by the betrayal. He then asked why this was happening, as they were all supposed to be friends. The mercenary responded that this was something Lewis had to face alone. As the sword was about to fall on Lewis's head, he stopped the blow. He invoked the system, saying he would use 1,000 hours. The sword went into overdrive, and his former companion asked, surprised, what kind of power this was. Lewis replied that earlier, he had been asked how he defeated Bior's knights. His companions thought he was just joking, but he had truly put his life on the line. Using Lom's blessing, all the ether was redirected with divine power, and Lewis prepared for vengeance. The knight's leader ordered a collective attack. Lewis smiled and taunted the traitor for thinking he was unarmed. Without hesitation, Lewis accessed the battlefield of the God of War. The setting was desolate, with various weapons scattered across the ground. The God of War's power enveloped Lewis, granting him access to any weapon there. A gleaming dagger called Lom's Flying Dagger caught his attention. With a new timer activated, he returned to the real world armed. In seconds, Lewis cut down the knights around him with deadly precision. When he reached the leader, he questioned him about the betrayal taking place. The traitor laughed disdainfully and insinuated that Lewis was expecting an answer about the family. With a swift motion, Lewis removed the dagger from the battlefield. The overheating of his body paused his ability momentarily. Lewis complained about the war god's help, which always left him on the brink of death. He began to reflect on the betrayal but refused to believe everyone had turned against him. Lewis entered the ruined tavern, covered in flames and fallen bodies, his eyes fixed on the body of an ally who was still alive. The ally, struggling, begged Lewis to flee, revealing that Tehran was the traitor. Before Lewis could react, the ally's body was cut in half. Tehran emerged from the flames with a cold smile. He observed Lewis with disdain and said his resistance was surprising. Tehran explained that he hadn't killed his companions, only removed them from his path. Lewis angrily stated that the others had always followed Tehran's orders. But Tehran responded that Lewis was the last one left. He didn't care what Lewis had to say, as the deal with Bior was secured. Bior had offered him nobility in exchange for the betrayal, and Tehran hadn't hesitated to accept it. Lewis, with cold determination, said he would defeat Tehran if he faced him again. He knew Tehran had abandoned everyone before, and now he would confront him. Tehran laughed and remarked that Lewis seemed clever. He asked if Lewis wasn't a noble in disguise, which made him even more interesting. Lewis slashed Tehran with a frontal strike, making him spit blood. With his final breath, Tehran still asked how Lewis wielded ether and acknowledged his potential. In his last words, Tehran admitted they had underestimated Lewis. With Tehran's fall, Lewis stood amidst the flames, reflecting on the 2 years spent with his companions. He thought about the years spent in a hospital, waiting for a death that never came. However, he knew everything would change in that world. After 2 years, he was the only survivor of that group. Lewis thought about the words he always said, "Nothing lasts forever." He drove his sword into the ground next to the others and walked away from the battlefield. That time had come sooner than expected, he thought, determined to move forward. He knew that the human life expectancy in that place was 80 years. For that, certain conditions had to be met. 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. But for Lewis, what mattered was something simple, taking someone's life. And so the cycle would begin again. Lewis arrived at the place where the mercenary needed authorization. However, he was denied by a bald man who said he needed money to survive. It turned out Lewis was in debt for 8,600 gold. The knight was shocked, saying he had never borrowed money in his life. He questioned what the man was talking about, unable to understand the situation. The bald man then revealed that the building where the group had been staying had burned down the previous day. Enraged, Lewis asked why he, of all people, had to pay for it. The banker pointed to the contract and explained that any damage to the property was the responsibility of the contractor. As a member of Terran's group, Lewis was held accountable for the damages. Lewis, stunned, questioned how he had never seen that contract before. The banker then pointed to Lewis Delracy's signature on the document. That's when Lewis remembered the time Terran asked him to sign the group's official registry. But he was mistaken. It was the house contract, not a simple registry. Grumbling, Lewis kept saying he had never seen that contract before. The banker responded, advising him to review contracts before signing anything. When Lewis stated he wouldn't pay for the repairs, the situation worsened. Dozens of people appeared with swords pointed at his neck. The bald man continued, saying that if he refused to pay, his mercenary title would be revoked. This meant he wouldn't be able to work as a mercenary in any region. Additionally, there would be a bounty on his head, which would attract hundreds of mercenaries from across the country. And since Lewis used ether, his head would be worth a high price. The banker then said Lewis had to make a decision. Lewis, smiling, replied that 1 minute would be enough for him. He knew that if he fought seriously, at least half of the banker's soldiers wouldn't walk out alive. He ordered them to lower their weapons before he got even more irritated. But soon, the bald man interrupted him and asked him to remain calm. After all, this was only the worst-case scenario. The banker believed it would be possible to reach a more favorable agreement for the mercenary. He explained that, in fact, it was more advantageous to earn money through loyalty, even by risking one's life. The Viscount had placed a large bounty because he wanted Lewis to destroy the entire illegal armed force hidden in the forest. The banker added that, in the past, the Viscount had tried sending people, but all had failed. Lewis, with an ironic smile, remarked that just a few days ago, he was the young man's enemy, but now his employer. Thinking about the job, Lewis reflected that the reward would be high since the armed forces would be faced as a group for a commission. But the Viscount probably didn't have the money needed to pay for the mission, thanks to the earlier agreement. Lewis's thoughts were interrupted by the banker, who told him that if he didn't accept, he would have to return everything. Lewis simply replied that he was thinking about what to do and that he would accept the mission. He walked out of the door angrily, already determined to face the task. The bald man then warned him that he needed to report back every 3 days. If he didn't, he would be considered missing, and a bounty would be placed to find him. As he thought about Lewis, the banker was almost certain he had forgotten something important. Quickly, he remembered the black forest Lewis was heading to, inhabited by demon beasts that appeared frequently. In the same place, the mercenary complained about the bald man not informing him about the beasts in the forest. He was surprised, as in this fantasy world, he had never encountered a demon beast while alive. Reasoning, Lewis began to wonder if these creatures could extend his lifespan since they were living beings. Consulting the system, he discovered that he could gain 60 hours from one of the beasts. This seemed much more advantageous than killing a person. The first time Lewis killed a person was vividly clear in his mind. The image of a human dying easily with ether. He told himself he was not Minhyuk. He was Lewis, living in a fantasy world, where the law of survival dictated everything. He had to do horrible things to survive. It made him feel awful and scared, but he knew it was necessary for his survival. Over time, he began to see humans as mere resources. The relief of having survived made Lewis feel fear again. However, that feeling didn't last long. In this world, sympathy never helped him. Killing the demon beasts made Lewis forget the fear. He had earned days of life by killing. It was as if he didn't want to live this way, but life forced him to. After killing the beasts with his sword, he wondered if that was all of them. He believed that massacre should guarantee him more time. He told himself he could live without killing humans, but questioned if he should become a beast hunter. A bearded man interrupted his reflection. He said Lewis wasn't a beast hunter. Lewis had barely managed to reach the forest. The man asked if Lewis thought being a beast hunter was easy. Lewis replied he couldn't say, but if he tried, he would find out. The man introduced himself as a beast hunter of the forest. Demon beasts had emerged half a century ago on the continent. They were mutants, aggressive and challenging. Some could fight knights on equal footing, and those who hunted them were known as beast hunters. Among the rules, the first one was clear. Never hunt in another beast hunter's territory. even if the beast was low level. Thanks to the hunter, Lewis was safe. But a knight appeared and said Lewis could take all the bodies. He didn't care about the spoils. Lewis asked about the illegal armed force in the forest. The hunter replied that the Viscount referred to them as beast hunters. Lewis then decided to take back his words and attacked. The mercenary said it wasn't personal, he was just doing his job. The hunter grabbed Lewis's sword with one hand. He asked if Lewis was alone. He spoke about the expeditions that had failed in the area. Lewis needed to put in more strength to win. Lewis wondered how he managed to hold his sword without ether. The hunter explained that there were many like Lewis during the Holy War. But Lewis didn't care and imbued electricity into his sword. He advanced, attempting a slash. When he realized his sword had been broken, the hunter pushed him away with a strike. Lewis fell, coughing up blood. The hunter advanced again, aiming at Lewis. Lewis drew a dagger. At the moment of collision, he blocked the hunter's punch with the dagger. He points the blade at the hunter's neck. The hunter, amused, says he's starting to like Lewis, but he doesn't want to take it any further. He wonders what to do with the unconscious Lewis. He says that if Lewis leaves, he'll be devoured by beasts. Lewis notices the hunter's severed hand. The hunter, excited, says he's found someone interesting. Lewis thinks about how much he hates this world. A world where he has to kill another human being. When the battle ends, he stands on a mountain of corpses, searching for anyone still alive. He only wants to kill more efficiently. Then he hears Terran's voice. He looks at the broken body of his former leader. Terran says it's the worst lie. He asks why Lewis is lying to himself. As Lewis looks at his own face, he notices a smile while killing. He wakes up surrounded by men. A mercenary asks where he was, but the hunter scolds the mercenary. He tells him not to shout randomly. Lewis remembers fainting while fighting the hunter. A man, who refers to Lewis as boss, asks how serious he was against the mercenary. Delrosi asks why the hunter is called the boss. The man introduces himself as Gilpad. He is the chief executive of the city's beast hunters. Gilpad welcomes Lewis. He says Lewis has been in the city for 3 days. Gilpad comments that he didn't expect Lewis to stay unconscious for 3 days. Lewis remembers the bald man's warnings about needing to report every 3 days. The knight introduces himself as Louis Delrosi, a warrior. The townsfolk ask if he's a mercenary. Gilpad replies that Lewis came on a solo mission. The townsfolk mock him, saying he's as foolish as he is brave. Lewis thinks about being defeated by a man, but if he starts attacking the weak, he'll have plenty of time. He plans to kill the hunter using the war god's power, but he knows it's the only way. He's not even sure he can continue his mission. If he fails, he'll be expelled as a fugitive. Gilpad exclaims how Lewis's life seems to go wrong. He asks if Lewis still wants to be a hunter. Lewis says it's only been a few days since Gilpad knocked him out, but he already wants to accept him as a member. Gilpad says it won't be for free. Lewis will have to hunt beasts to live there. Beast spoils are in high demand. Their meat is used in cuisine. Other parts are used in magical experiments. Lewis thinks that hunting beasts could buy him time, so it's a good offer. Gilpad says Lewis seems interested, and that he will undergo an entrance test. He shows a drawing of a beast called a stone monkey. These beasts inhabit the eastern side of the forest. Gilpad says Lewis could easily defeat some of them. Their hides are highly valued. Lewis accepts the challenge and heads to the eastern forest. But upon arrival, he encounters 4-meter beasts in groups. Lewis is forcefully repelled. His ether sword flies far away. It lands meters away. The mercenary mutters angrily. He finds the situation unbearable. The creatures regenerate on their own. With a deafening screech, the stone monkey charges at Lewis. The deadly punch approaches at great speed. Lewis is ready for the attack. With precision, he delivers a decisive strike. The stone monkey's head is split in half. The creature falls lifeless to the ground. He looks at the 2 remaining monkeys. His eyes are cold and calculating. Lewis prepares for his next move. He knows what he has to do. You'll follow the same path, he thinks, watching them. The combat is about to end. Lewis feels an odd calm amid the battle. He has defeated 2 of them with ease. Now, only the last one remains. Back in the village, Gilpad awaits him. The head hunter examines the cut hides. They won't fetch a single coin, he comments. Lewis doesn't know how to respond. He knows he has failed. You cut them wrong, Gilpad corrects. These hides must be cut below the neck. Lewis listens silently. Gilpad's critique makes him reflect. He still has much to learn. Gilpad continues in a firm tone. Starting tomorrow, you'll learn from David. Lewis accepts without question. He knows he needs to improve. 2 weeks pass. Lewis returns to the village with 2 stone monkey heads. He's already starting to get used to the hunter's life. He cuts the beast's arms with precision. The other hunters are surprised. Were you a butcher? One of the hunters asks. Lewis looks at them, unsure how to respond. He hasn't fully adapted yet, but he knows it's part of the process. During the day's meal, Lewis was served soup made with beast meat. The taste was strong, almost unpleasant. He could barely swallow it. But the others didn't seem to mind. Everyone at the table collapsed after the meal. Lewis stopped focusing on the time he had left. It felt as if he was beginning a new life. He sensed something different within himself. It was a strange yet comforting feeling. Gilpad watched him from a distance, intrigued. David remarked that Lewis was starting to adapt, but Lewis remained distant. He didn't let his emotions show. Gilpad remembered when Lewis first arrived. He rejected all food offered to him. Distrust seemed to be ingrained in his nature. Lewis didn't trust anyone, not even the food he was given. Gilpad questioned Lewis's behavior. "Do you think the food is poison?" Lewis remained silent. He never voiced his doubts aloud. His gaze spoke louder than any words. David eventually concluded that he wasn't a spy. Gilpad quickly changed the subject. He began talking about other hunters who had gone missing. Someone needed to investigate. The hunter approached Lewis without preamble. "You'll head to Jana's post tomorrow." Lewis simply nodded. He knew what needed to be done. The hunter explained that the forest was too vast. Jana's post was far, beyond the controlled area. Lewis was to check on the post and bring back news. The day seemed calm, but he knew it wouldn't last. Lewis walked with renewed purpose. He wasn't as rushed as before. Now, a sense of tranquility filled his being. But he knew the peace was temporary. Suddenly, his foot struck something hard. It was a human body lying on the ground. The uniform indicated it was a hunter. Lewis approached to examine the body. The death had been caused by a sharp blade. The wound didn't seem to have been made by a beast. It was something more calculated, more human. Lewis paid close attention to the details. He recognized the pattern in the cuts. Suddenly, a girl appeared. She watched Lewis with a frightened look. He asked her in a cold voice if her uniform was from Jana's post. She trembled in fear and quickly explained herself. She was fleeing from the Viscount's forces. Jana's post had been invaded and destroyed. Lewis listened to her words in silence. The girl's face was pale, streaked with tears. Without hesitation, Lewis reassured her. "It's all right," he said calmly. The girl seemed somewhat relieved, but the tension in the air remained palpable. More mercenaries appeared in large numbers. They recognized Lewis, the Soul Collector. Fear was evident on their faces. They knew his history with Bjor's guild. Lewis faced the mercenaries. His presence was imposing, threatening. Without hesitation, he drew his sword. The battle was swift and decisive. All the mercenaries fell, defeated. One of them, desperate, took the girl hostage. He threatened to kill her, holding a blade to her neck. Lewis didn't flinch. His sword flew precisely. The mercenary was disarmed in a single move. He fled before he could react. The girl, grateful, clung to Lewis's arm. "Thank you for saving me," she whispered emotionally. Unmoved, Lewis looked at the destroyed town. It was in ruins, covered in corpses. The girl mourned the loss of Jana's good people. Lewis observed the bodies scattered across the village. He noticed something familiar in the cuts, and a distant memory resurfaced in his mind. The marks were similar to those he had seen on Tehran. It reminded him of a past ability, an ability that now seemed so distant. But at some level, someone still carried it within them. Cries of pain filled the air as a man crawled clumsily on the ground. He was watched from above by a knight wielding an axe, who regarded him as no more than an insect. With a weak, gasping voice, the man asked the knight if he truly believed he was safe after that attack. But before he could finish his threat, he was silenced by a crushing blow that ended his life. The knight raised his bloodied axe and declared that he cared little about what Gilpad or anyone else would do afterward. He was simply following orders and would eliminate anyone opposing the Viscount without hesitation. Meanwhile, a subordinate silently approached the leader, Marco, bringing urgent news. With an alarmed tone, he revealed that scouts had attacked the eastern region and encountered the Soul Collector. Upon hearing the news, Marco furrowed his brow and asked if Lewis was nearby. With a cold smile, he stated that this made everything more interesting, as he eagerly anticipated a direct confrontation with Lewis. Back at the village, Gilpad interrogated Lewis about the Viscount's recent movements and objectives in the region. Lewis explained that, after losing a recent war, the Viscount was sending the surviving warriors to reinforce that territory. Gilpad reflected and concluded that the attacks would become frequent and coordinated over time. He declared with conviction that he would capture the soldiers alive to create significant problems for the Viscount. Lewis questioned if it wouldn't be more efficient to eliminate them immediately. Gilpad sternly reprimanded him, stating that they were not assassins and had principles to uphold. With a hesitant expression, Lewis nodded but mentioned the presence of an extremely skilled knight among the enemies. He commented that if it was who he thought it was, the battle would be far more challenging than expected. Gilpad listened attentively but remained firm in his stance and turned to the girl with a reassuring look. He explained that he was organizing everyone's roles and assured her that she wouldn't have to fight directly. Despite her fear, the girl expressed relief upon hearing she wouldn't be forced to engage in combat on the battlefield. Gilpad assured her that there was a perfect role for her that didn't involve fighting. In the darkness of an isolated area, the girl stood next to Lewis, watching a bonfire as they waited for the right moment. Suddenly, the enemy knights began to approach, led by Marco, who carried an intimidating presence. Marco observed the bonfire and commented that it was too obvious a setup to ignore. With a quick gesture, he ordered his soldiers to advance carefully and investigate the area. One of the soldiers approached, kicking Louis, who was hooded, and demanded to know where the others were. Before he could finish his movement, his leg was severed in a swift and precise attack. Louis turned to the girl and ordered her to retreat immediately to the post while he dealt with the situation. The knights advanced together, questioning if Louis was alone, but were caught off guard by hidden traps. Several soldiers fell into a deep pit that opened before them, while others were struck down by a massive log. On the other side, additional soldiers were captured in a large net, leaving them vulnerable. With a mocking tone, Gilpad appeared, declaring that today's soldiers were more foolish than he had imagined. As he observed Marco, he asked if he was the skilled knight Louis had mentioned. Marco ignored the provocation and ordered his soldiers to cut the ropes and escape the trap quickly. Gilpad smiled and warned that cutting the ropes would cause them all to fall into the deep pit below. Louis stepped forward when called and faced Marco directly in an energetic and technical clash. Marco skillfully blocked Louis's attack, and the two began to clash impressively. During the exchange of blows, Louis noticed that Marco's style strongly resembled Terran's, a legendary warrior. He asked if Marco was Terran but received an irritated response that Terran was already dead. As the battle heated up, a massive demonic beast appeared behind them with a threatening roar. The creature's presence caused everyone to stop and look back, while the remaining soldiers became cornered. Louis thought about how strong demon hunters must be to use beasts to control the battlefield. But his thoughts were interrupted by Gilpad, who ordered everyone to stop, as there were beasts on the loose. Despite the initial shock, Louis grew frustrated with Gilpad's decision, but maintained his combat stance. With overwhelming strength, the beasts began to destroy the city as the fighters tried to organize a counterattack. Gilpad ordered his allies to evacuate the civilians while he led the defenses against the creature's attacks. Louis and Marco's fight was interrupted when one of the beasts delivered a devastating punch against them. Gilpad tried to warn that this wasn't the time for internal fights, but his warnings were ignored. The beast was eliminated by a synchronized double strike, showcasing the power level of the two warriors in the field. The ether merely repelled the beast's head with force, sending it flying. That clean, precise strike was executed entirely by Gilpad, who wasn't using any weapons. With the strength of the attack, the beast finally fell to the ground, and Gilpad, still surprised, questioned what was really happening. He wondered why a stone monkey was so deep in the forest since these creatures rarely ventured into the most dangerous areas. However, he was taken aback when he heard the civilians around him saying that the protective barrier had been breached. This breach meant that all the beast attacks would now reach their targets without any resistance. Before he could process this new information, the hunter who had given the warning was suddenly attacked and had his head devoured by a wolf beast. In the next instant, hundreds of wolf beasts appeared from all directions, creating a scene of complete panic, with many wondering what such a powerful class of creatures was doing in that place. It was absolute chaos, with the wolves chasing civilians and attacking mercilessly while people desperately tried to escape. Gilpad felt the weight of the situation increase drastically, and wondered why an invasion like this would happen at that exact moment. With the impact of a beast's fall, caused by a joint attack from Louis and Marco, the commander appeared and began asking what was happening in that part of the battlefield. However, before anyone could respond, a beast attempted to attack Gilpad from behind, but he was saved by Louis, who intervened quickly with an ether strike. Louis's ether strike was precise, cutting off the stone monkey's head, and he warned everyone to combine their efforts to deal with the situation. Louis explained that the stone monkey's heads had to be severed to prevent infinite regeneration, and instructed them to focus on the heads and stop acting recklessly. Marco, on the other hand, claimed he could handle it alone, and Louis simply agreed with his statement. A new beast approached, and the commander shouted for the collector not to die during the fight. He advanced with his axe, imbued his blade with ether, and declared that Louis would die anyway, even if it was by his hand. With a lumberjack strike, the commander cut down several stone monkeys but was soon interrupted by an attack from Louis, who warned him not to attack from behind if he didn't want to die. Louis removed the commander's helmet, revealing that he wasn't Terran, as many had assumed. Marco, surprised, asked if Louis had never heard of his father before. Intrigued, Louis asked who Marco's father was, but the young man replied that he was the son of Terran, the leader Louis had recently killed. Louis, with a perplexed expression, wondered since when that old man had a son and asked Marco if he sought revenge for his father's death. However, the commander, with a sarcastic smile, said he was grateful Louis had eliminated that useless old man, as he was never truly a threat. The soldiers around them, still stunned by the words, felt a tremor rising from beneath the earth. The resounding noise seemed like a prelude to something even more terrifying emerging from below. The soldiers began questioning what it could be, but they were soon surprised by an attack from a new beast. One of the soldiers, desperate, cried out for help as he was dragged toward the beast's maw. Gilpod acted quickly, delivering a direct ether strike and saving the soldier just in time. The soldier, gasping for breath, asked why he was saved, but the hunter simply replied that as long as he could speak, he should help his comrades first. Gilpod then shouted to the army, warning that the barrier had been broken and there was no retreat, so everyone needed to focus on saving the civilians. Lewis, visibly irritated, asked if Gilpod was crazy for saving enemies, saying it wasn't worth helping those who were clearly doomed. But Gilpod reprimanded him, saying that no one should judge who is worthless and that saving people was a noble act, regardless of their circumstances. Lewis was surprised by the response but began reflecting on what truly mattered in those moments. In Lewis's world, morality was a flexible concept, while in Gilpod's world, there was a much stricter and more honorable knightly discipline. Gilpod not only saved lives but fought bravely against the beasts, demonstrating what it truly meant to be a knight. Marco, with a look of disdain, asked why someone as strong as Gilpod would sacrifice himself to save the weak. He argued that even if they were saved, the civilians wouldn't be able to fight the beasts attacking them. Marco then, with an ether-infused strike to his axe, declared that the strong should be the ones solving the problem and not wasting time saving the weak. Lewis, realizing Marco's recklessness, ordered him to stop immediately, warning that if he used his power, he would harm his own comrades. Marco, with an ironic smile, replied that he already knew that and in this situation, the only choice was to attack. But before he could continue, the collector intervened with an ether-infused sword strike, questioning if Marco truly didn't care about his comrades. Marco, angry, responded that he never wanted to kill his comrades, only to use others for a greater purpose, and questioned if the collector really had empathy, considering he had killed hundreds of people without hesitation. Lewis, agreeing with Marco's words, asks why he should save people from beasts sent to kill him when he himself is a specialist in killing. However, it didn't matter what Gilpod did or said because, as Marco pointed out, the collector was a master of killing. With a swift movement, Lewis cuts off Marco's arm, thanking him for reminding him of who he truly was, and says he will now cut his entire body apart. Marco asks how he could do such a thing, but as Lewis glances at his counter, the soul collector has 940 hours left. He thinks about how Marco is nothing but trash compared to Tehran. Yet Marco is still a knight. Therefore, he must give him at least 60 hours. Lewis says it's nothing personal. Marco's life, he explains, will be used for the greater good. Finally, Lewis drives his sword into the commander's chest. As he rises, Lewis notices that Marco isn't dead. He wonders if he should strike again, until he's interrupted by another tremor. A roar comes from a gigantic, red beast. Lewis wonders how absurdly large this beast is. Gilpod explains that it's called the Red Bear, the master of the mountain. The creature emerges from the stone mountain. Lewis wonders what triggered its appearance. A sudden strike sends Lewis flying. It's Marco attacking. Marco has absorbed a spike monkey crystal. This allows his body to regenerate. Enraged, Marco screams at Lewis for calling him a piece of trash. He recalls the time when he trained under Tehran, who slashed his face with an axe. Marco's father once said that if he couldn't defend himself, he was an idiot, and in a real fight he would die. Marco accuses Tehran of being insane for planning to crush his own son's head, but Tehran replies that it's normal during training. If his son isn't a coward, he will stand up. Otherwise, he'll die on a battlefield like garbage. And if he's garbage, then he can be called as such. When Marco joined the army, everyone talked about a knight from a hunter's family and mocked him for being weak. But the reason he was accepted by the Viscount was that his father had betrayed his companions. Since Marco had such a terrible father, people assumed he was just as bad. However, Marco simply killed the two men mocking him, which caught the attention of Viscount Bior. While soldiers restrained him, as if to execute him, Bior questioned why Marco had done such a thing. The soldiers ordered Marco to answer the Viscount, but Marco replied that they were the real bastards, as noble knights fought and died in the field for the Viscount's name. So how could he judge weakness? The Viscount asked if it would make any difference if he were there. Marco agreed, saying he was far more worthy than those men because he was strong and had already proven his strength. Bior asked if Marco was finished proving his point, calling him foolish yet acknowledging him as a true warrior. Then, Bior declared that Marco, Terran's son, would become the commander of the army. The Viscount admitted that he understood the risks of appointing Marco as leader, but it was the position his father should have held. Marco questioned if he was being given the role solely because of his father. Bior replied that it wasn't the only reason. After all, Tehran was dead. Shocked, Marco asked if his father had really been killed. The Viscount explained that it wasn't confirmed, but Terran's entire troop had been annihilated. Except for the soul collector Lewis. Marco reflected on the advantages he had gained, having even killed Teheran and his group. Bjorn noticed Marco showed no sadness over his father's death. The new commander replied that his father always said being weak would only make you garbage. So, if his father had died, he must have been garbage. Thus, Marco had no time to mourn the death of trash. The Viscount agreed and challenged Marco to prove his point. He directed Marco's attention to a massive rock. It symbolized the Black Forest, home to demonic beasts. While they couldn't confirm much, the beasts were essential for resources and high profits. However, recently, they had encountered numerous expenses. The Viscount needed more sources of income. Ruffians plagued the forest. Marco asked if he should eliminate all of them. The Viscount confirmed and blessed Marco's success, presenting him with a gift. He handed Marco a green potion. Marco questioned what it was. With a smile, the Viscount said it wasn't anything special and should only be used if Marco faced a strong opponent, for it would be of great help. Back in the present, Marco charges at Lewis with his stone monkey arm, which clashes against Lewis's ether-infused sword, causing a massive impact. The commander questions where the spirit of the soul collector has gone, as he only defends. With a barrage of punches, Marco forces Lewis to retreat, who says to cut his arm again. Retreating, Lewis is met with an aerial ether attack, leaving no time to react. A blow that shatters the ground around him. But it is blocked by Gilpad with his bare hands, who then counters with a punch to Marco, apologizing for intervening, saying he too was in an urgent situation. With a powerful strike, he hurls Marco away. Lewis thanks Gilpad for helping him but insists he could have defeated Marco alone. However, the hunter punches him, knocking him unconscious. He states that Lewis had crossed the line of what a demon beast hunter could handle. The soldiers hurriedly flee the battle while the hunters question where Viscount Bjorn's knights had gone. Yet everyone is heading in the same direction, accompanying the unconscious Lewis. One of the soldiers comments grimly, saying that if Gilpad deals with Lewis after this, he will make him even crueler than he already was. The hunter beside him agrees, murmuring that Lewis will surely resent him, but this is undoubtedly the best method to let outsiders handle their own problems. After all, the battle wouldn't be easy. They were destined to face the greatest danger alongside a legion of hunters. Hearing the heavy steps of advancing wolves, he could only imagine the catastrophe that would occur if that monster, the Red Bear, appeared outside. An unparalleled destruction waiting to unfold. Gilpad, however, seems calm. He says that if they were to die now, at least they would have fulfilled their role, buying time for the civilians to escape and save themselves from the storm. With one last glance, the soldiers advance, ready for battle. Half a century ago, a ruthless invasion brought with it the force of the demon god Chaos. He and his army invaded the continent with devastating fury, forcing everyone to unite against him. What followed was the Holy War, a conflict that everyone would remember. During this time, various species united to form alliances and fight for survival. However, the effects of this war were catastrophic, leaving nearly all races on the brink of extinction, except for humans. Since then, demon beasts began to appear across every corner of the continent. Emperor Truasan, recognized as the greatest hero of the Holy War, decreed that aristocrats take responsibility for the problems caused by demon beasts. As a result, all knights were, in some way, forced to volunteer to manage the areas most affected by these attacks. A young Gilpad once saw a soldier about to execute a knight, and firmly told him to wait. He questioned, in a low voice, why young knights should be executed when the true responsibility lay with the aristocrats. Moreover, if this was the emperor's real desire, he should be held accountable. The emperor's silence was his only response, leaving Gilpad's doubts unresolved. It was then that a priest approached, reprimanding him for his insolence in questioning the emperor's authority, and suggesting that he take the knight's place if he was so bold. Gilpad remained silent. In that moment, he turned away, choosing to live as a hunter in the forest, without regrets. If death was his destiny, he would face it head-on, and claim it as his own. Soon, the hunters began battling the beasts, including ferocious wolves, but they quickly realized there were far more creatures than they had imagined. The number of beasts seemed endless. One hunter, vigilant, sensed a mysterious and powerful energy moving in the area, emanating from the mountain's ruler, a massive bear. Wolves attacked Gilpad with fury, but he responded with speed and precision, telling himself it wasn't enough to just deal with the red bear. Now there were also these wolves. With a brutal advance, he eliminated dozens of wolves, moving toward the stone monkeys. Using ether concentrated in his fists, he struck down several monsters in a series of quick and relentless blows. He reasoned that the beast explosion in the area must be connected to the giant bear. With a precise and devastating punch, he charged at the mountain's ruler, determined to understand the mysterious energy with his own eyes. The bear's chest was shattered by his blow, revealing a massive crystal, but the crystal exploded before he could land the next attack. From a distance, Penil, the cook, watches the explosion while Lewis, still unconscious, awakens, asking what is happening and where the cook is taking him. He expresses his frustration with Gilpad, questioning why the hunter acted without warning. Penil, trying to calm him, replies that there isn't much to explain and that Lewis needs to listen carefully. The beast known as the Red Bear gathers ether in the sacred stone on its chest, and with its colossal size, it represents a catastrophe for everyone. It was at that moment that Gilpad ordered Penil to take Lewis out of the forest to prevent him from facing more danger. Lewis, confused, asks what he is talking about and challenges the cook. If the situation is so dangerous, he should return and save Gilpad because they all work together. But Penil, trembling with fear, begs Lewis to help evacuate everyone from the forest and inform the Empire of the imminent threat since the situation is about to become unsustainable. Hearing the plea, Lewis hesitates, but before he can react, Marco appears and cuts off Penil's arm, saying it was close, but the blade didn't pierce Lewis. Marco, with a cruel smile, declares that the weak are merely fuel for the strong. In a moment of rage and frustration, Lewis holds Penil, who is now coughing up blood, as the cook begs him to flee and survive. With one last look at Penil's fallen body, Lewis questions whether the weak truly serve as fuel for the strong. Then, holding a dagger, he declares that Marco is right and, with a swift strike, ends the cook's suffering. Marco, now unhinged, begins to laugh maniacally, mocking Lewis for killing his own companion and suggesting that Lewis should take a closer look at himself. But Lewis, without hesitation, coldly responds that he will set things right. With Lom's flying dagger, he pierces Marco's body before the commander can react. In his final breath, Marco is split in half by the blade, unable to make a move. Lewis then faces the situation and, with a resolute expression, murmurs to himself that he will use his fate in a much better way. Standing before Marco's fallen body, Delrosi observes that regeneration is impossible if the head is severed. Not only regeneration but also the time Marco had gained. It was all similar to the spike monkeys. Lewis, however, wonders, could a human possess the abilities of a demonic beast? As intriguing as it is, it doesn't matter. What truly matters is dealing with the gigantic beast ahead. Looking at Penil's body on the ground, Lewis decides he must leave that place soon. Determined, he advances to where Gilpad is fighting. He tells himself he won't stop until this is resolved. Meanwhile, Gilpad is under pressure from the beast, wondering if the Red Bear is even defeatable. With a deafening roar, the hunter orders everyone to attack at once without hesitation. But even using ether, they can't injure the monster. Suddenly, spikes and mouths begin to emerge from the beast's skin, attacking the hunters. Gilpad warns the others that something is changing. However, the beast has already become deformed, with several mouths attacking and easily consuming the hunters. Gilpad recalls that this phenomenon occurred during the Holy War. Those enormous mouths were the source of the beast's unimaginable power. The mouths charge at the hunter, but he counters, shouting that the monster cannot be defeated unless those mouths are destroyed. Wounded by one of the mouths, Gilpad uses ether, delivering a powerful punch that repels all the beast's attacks. His strike severs the connection of the mouths, causing massive damage to the Red Bear. Thus, he advances toward the beast's core, determined not to allow any more casualties. With his next attack, Gilpad would finish the beast, but the crystal doesn't yield. Even with all the ether the hunter pours into it, he cannot cause any damage. The monster immediately begins to regenerate, forcing Gilpad to cling to its skin. Headbutting the crystal with all his strength, he tries to destroy it but fails to inflict any damage. Gilpad starts to think that if he collapses, everyone around will be affected by the beast's anomaly. Before he can reason further, he is interrupted by a familiar voice, commenting on the enormous noise. Thanks to that noise, Lewis had no trouble finding Gilpad. With the flying dagger in hand, Lewis informs his leader that he will strike the beast with all his strength. He orders Lom to switch the equipment, transforming the dagger into dual swords. The system warns that every second, 12 hours of Lewis's life will be consumed. Gilpad wonders if he is seeing things correctly at that moment. The power before him wasn't ether. It was the power of the god of war, Lom. With a precise strike, Lewis splits the crystal in half, cutting the beast along with it. This causes the entire body of the Red Bear to explode in a burst of ether. All the hunters wonder if Gilpad was capable of doing that, saying the battle was finally over and they were safe. Lewis then approaches and says he would like to ask his leader something. If it weren't for him, Gilpad would have died, so Lewis doesn't understand why he acted so recklessly when he could have simply left and gone to Viscount Bior. Gilpad responds, thinking Lewis would ask something else, but says that as a demon beast hunter, his mission is to hunt beasts. Therefore, why would he leave such a large beast to another hunter? Lewis then says he understands. But now the hunter complains that it wasn't the boy's job. Delrosi, however, simply questions what wasn't his job and whether he would leave such a beast for another. She notes that Lewis's counter has increased significantly. Gilpad then continues, saying he couldn't ignore it, as it was his responsibility as a demon beast hunter to deal with it. Gilpad laughs, asking if Lewis considers himself a hunter with those abilities. But could he really be a hunter if he destroyed everything around him and left no trace? Lewis, with a confident smile, simply asks the hunter to teach him. Gilpad agrees, saying he will seriously train him soon. Lewis says he looks forward to it but suddenly collapses to the ground, exhausted. Gilpad asks if he's okay, but Lewis simply shakes his head. It is then that a warning appears, stating that Lewis can no longer use Lom's divine protection. A blonde man in a hood says he doesn't want to work and asks if the Black Forest has been securely sealed as per the previous report, and if they were really there for things like these. But a pink-haired woman beside him tells him to pay attention to his actions, because the seal on the Black Forest was created by the surrounding stone mountain. So, it wouldn't be a small problem if it broke, because they would be involved in the event. The blonde replies that she only agrees with him sometimes, but the woman retorts that this wasn't the case. He tells her not to be so harsh since he's doing this to avoid getting nervous, because she knows what happens when a seal breaks. Then all the magic power inside is released, polluting everything nearby, turning it into dead land. So, just mentioning it already makes him nauseous. However, the woman tells him not to vomit, as the situation seems to have already been resolved. The blonde asks why it's so quiet there, and reveals that the girl's name is Jean, questioning if that is the correct location. Jean, in turn, confirms that it is the Black Forest in the north of Chawasan. Then the blonde asks why it's in this state but says it's an interesting situation. Lewis searched the entire forest but only captured one beast, which was a stark change from the lively forest of days ago, because the number of beasts had drastically decreased. The reason was probably the gigantic beast. At least, that was what Gilpad assumed. But more serious than that was why the system had changed to no longer allow the use of Lom's blessing for no apparent reason. His master quickly interrupts, asking what kind of disciple makes the master wait so long. And since he asked Gilpad to teach him, he should show determination. But Lewis retorts that his master seems excited. Since he can't use Lom's blessing, he has been fighting more using his own ether. And after this incident with the berserker giant beast, there were significant sacrifices. The fallen comrades were buried near the village with a brief farewell. Bjor's soldiers were also buried alongside them. Gilpad questions David, unsure if they would have liked that. But David responds, saying they feel better being able to rest forever. With a smile, the hunter tells them to rest and see him soon. Penil was buried alongside them, and Lewis only hoped he could prepare proper food in the next life. But now the boy was being trained by Gilpad, who teaches him not just to wrap his body in ether but to release it by targeting specific points. Delivering a punch to Lewis, he explains that they would be pierced if he simply wrapped everything. Then he must concentrate ether on the right points. But the master questions if Lewis really won't explain how he is able to use divine power since he clearly saw Lom during the last battle. Lewis avoids the question, saying Gilpad must have seen it wrong, but he is struck during an opening. However, Gilpad understands and says that if Lewis has a reason, he won't ask again. The young man considers telling his master about the system and the fact that he's not from this world, but wonders if Gilpad would even believe him. Soon, Lewis announces that it's the girl's turn, introducing her as Belle. He tells his master to go easy on her because she's been in a bad mood all week. But Gilpad admits that he made a mistake accepting her as a disciple, yet says she is certainly not ordinary. She has more than enough to become a knight. He recalls that when she returned from the battlefield, Belle looked like a ghost. The girl then bows to Lewis, thanking him and calling him senior, but he simply asks her to stop joking. She bids farewell in the same manner, and Lewis complains that it's embarrassing, asking her not to do it again. But Belle says it's simply a sign of respect. Lewis sits under a tree, watching the two train. Gilpad orders Belle to feel the ether, but the girl insists she wants to train with swords. Her master asks if she thinks being a knight is easy, explaining that she must start with the basics. But Belle simply states that she likes using swords. Two visitors arrive unexpectedly, and the blonde man calls Gilpad uncle. The man grumbles that it's been a year since the blonde visited. The blonde replies that he was simply looking for a path that crossed through there. Gilpad dismisses this as a lie and introduces Lewis, saying the blonde is the chief hunter among the negotiators. Lewis observes that they don't seem to have weapons yet came without an escort. Gilpad quickly asks why they are there. The blonde man asks if anyone capable of using divine power is present. The hunter feigns surprise but is soon caught in a magical restraint, with the man deducing that the one they're searching for is there. Everyone is caught in the restraint. Lewis wonders what it is but deduces that the man must be a mage to suppress everyone at once. The blonde apologizes for being rude, explaining that this is an important task. Gilpad demands to be released. However, the man tells him to listen, explaining the unusual phenomenon involving the Great Crystal Stone. He's unsure what happened, but it was a sealing stone. This type of stone can only be destroyed by divine power, meaning someone there possesses it. They came to check the power of the Devis. He adds that they didn't just come for the human with divine powers, it could also be a heretic. Thus, they would like to negotiate. Gilpod remarks that the man knows too much about the incident, suggesting it isn't his first time. The man agrees, saying it happens occasionally. Gilpod questions why they weren't informed. Since only divine power can destroy it, many casualties could have been avoided. He could have prevented this before the accident. The nephew agrees, admitting that could have been the approach, but it's why they didn't tell him. Because the area would lose the byproduct of demonic power. The old hunter bursts into laughter, acknowledging the point. But the blonde continues, saying that because it's a stable place for beast byproducts, it could provide good work and benefit both sides. His speech is interrupted by Gilpud's fist, despite the hunter denying violence. However, the man blocks the attack. Jean appears with 2 divine swords and reveals the nephew's name as Tezwa. She admonishes him to think carefully before speaking. Lewis watches Jean block Gilpud's strike impressively. The hunter steps back and comments that she can form a sword using ether. Only one family on the continent is known for this method, the Frozen Child's family. They are famously the laziest sword family in the world. Jean says he can refer to her as the 3rd best sword empress. She dislikes the nickname, Lazy Sword. Gilpod laughs, asking if she feels uncomfortable, but he insists on seeing what she can do. Charging toward the girl, he explains that there are 8 prominent sword families on the continent. Among them, only 3 are officially trusted by the emperor himself. The first is Croyd, the electric one, known as the sharpest sword. The second is Shefmun, the mist, known as the heaviest sword in the world. And the third, finally, is the family that uses ether solidification to create a temporary weapon, in exchange for losing their freedom of movement. The lazy sword, Frozen Child's. Jean charges at Gilpod with her swords, which had previously been broken by the man, only for them to be destroyed again by his fists. The hunter remarks that she must have a limit to the number of weapons she can create at once. However, before he finishes his sentence, Jean conjures dozens of aether swords that strike Gilpod. The woman says it was a good attempt after learning the child's family's weakness, but it's not as if they had been playing around the whole time. She threatens Gilpod to stay where he is since the swords were sharpened piece by piece. So, he should start talking about the man who uses divine power. The hunter replies that she talks too much, and that it's not as if he's going to say anything. Jean draws one of the swords and aims at Gilpod's arm, saying she prefers not to be aggressive, but she will have to take one of his arms. However, before she acts, Lewis begins to speak, asking her to wait, warning that he was the one who used divine power, and telling her to release the old man. Gilpod, for his part, says they should stop after taking his arm. Tezwa uses magic to draw Lewis in, asking if that's really his name. Lewis asks what he plans to do. The mage says he's going to check if Lewis is telling the truth, then touches Lewis's forehead, creating a magic circle. Because, regardless of the energy he uses, there should be a direct indication in his body. Lewis is affected by the magic, feeling an uncomfortable energy coursing through his bones, realizing that all the mages had carried that power within their bodies all along. Yeshua merely releases everyone, remarking how incredible it is. Jean apologizes for her rude actions against Gilpod, who complains that her actions don't match her words. The mage asks Lewis for a moment to speak in private, but Lewis complains, saying they could just talk right there. Tezwa, however, warns that this will be a problem and whispers that Lewis is from another world. The sealing stone caused a religious war to maintain the demon's power scattered, and there are few stones surrounding the world. Among them was the one in the Black Forest. But somehow, the stone mountain was destroyed without any evidence, and this happened simultaneously. Lewis asks if he followed Yeshua just to tell stories. However, the mage explains this to emphasize what it means to break the stone while wielding a god's power. But why is Lewis capable of using divine power while being a knight who uses ether? Lewis asks if that's the problem. The mage replies that it is indeed a big problem because divine power does not coexist with ether, and most people don't know how to use divine power like ether. Lewis quickly connects this to the fact that he used divine power to restore his ether when using both. But from the beginning, he hadn't known the power he was wielding, and as the mage said, that power is known to only a few. So, that was why Gilpod interrogated him when he saw Lom. But something doesn't add up. How did he know Lewis was from another world? Tezwa asks if the mercenary wants to say a prayer, not because he doubts Lewis's power but to see his connection with God. Lewis questions if he can connect with God through prayer, and the mage says that's interesting, noting that Lewis is saying he doesn't communicate with Lom, despite offering a prayer. Delrosi then mentions that Lewis recently had his contract with the god of war terminated. Tezwa states that a contract is equal for both parties, and Lewis is the first person to make a contract with God. Lewis reflects on how irritating it is that the mage is intelligent, and wonders if he should act crazy, saying the mage might know what he's thinking. But the blonde continues, saying his questions will never end. and asks if Louis wants to pray first. If he truly wishes for something with all his heart, God will respond. Focusing, Louis insults Lam, calling him a pig and summoning him. However, Louis is drawn into a mental space resembling a universe where, instead of Lam, a goddess appears saying the prayer reached her, introducing herself as the goddess of wealth and life, who will answer his call. Louis questions why she appeared when he called for Lam. The goddess explains that Lam will never hear his call because, ever since Louis arrived in this world, he has acted unilaterally. Hearing his requests, Lam rejected the agreement. Louis asks what she means by requests. The goddess explains that she initially came to reprimand him for his laziness. However, Louis entered this world in an unstable manner, unable to use the interface. Touching him, the goddess says he would be punished for this but adds that she will help him. She begins restoring the system and activates the main mission to delete the lifespan limitation system. Outside, Tezwa is impressed by how connected Louis is to Mercila's holy force. Whether it is ether, magical energy, or divine power, these foundations cannot coexist in a single body. Not only that, but divine power alone is considered difficult to endure if the body is not at a certain level. Yet the man before him is absorbing the energies of various gods as if it's nothing. Gilpad, sitting nearby, complains about his aching body, but Jean insists on asking if he has recovered. The hunter replies that he hasn't completely, and questions why this man was searching for someone using divine power. Jean claims to be just a servant, and doesn't question his actions. Gilpad retorts that she has no idea either, but Jean counters, explaining it's to prevent a threat among them. She adds that he shouldn't worry since nothing more will happen. Gilpad warns that it better not, because if anything happens to Louis, she will pay the price for messing with a member of his town, and will have to face him, the beast hunter. He then releases his aura toward her. Jean feels the pressure and comments that he didn't fight with everything earlier. The hunter responds that nothing will happen anyway since he isn't stupid. Meanwhile, Belle asks Jean if she can inquire about the shining sword in her hand and how to create one. The swordswoman materializes an ether weapon in her hand. Gilpad scolds Belle for asking about a family's secret techniques, but he is surprised when Jean shows her the magical circles on her hand, calling them stigmas, which are the key to creating ether swords. The hunter remarks that it's a beautiful name she's given them, but says they're just circuits. Belle asks what circles are. Jean explains that ether has a positive characteristic that repels and a negative one that attracts. Thus, when a knight places an ether circle on their body, they simultaneously amplify both attack and defense. Gilpad interrupts, saying they are just ether pathways etched into the body. These pathways make ether circulate in specific directions, enabling special abilities typically impossible to perform. Jean says the child's family specializes in materialization, while Gilpad, jealous, tells his disciple not to be too fascinated by it. Belle asks if they have anything similar, and her master simply denies it. With a disappointed expression, she says she expected more from Gilpad. He reprimands her for being too ambitious, explaining that not everyone can inscribe spells to their advantage. Strength, he says, is meant to be built through effort and efficiency, not just through designs on the body. Belle retorts that Jean humiliated her master moments ago, and Gilpad asks where she learned such words. But the commotion is interrupted by Louis, who asks what is going on. His colleague welcomes him, and Gilpad questions if Tezwa did anything suspicious to him. Louis replies that everything has been settled, but his master doesn't accept the vague answer and demands he respond directly. Jean asks Tezwa if he can control divine power. He agrees, saying he can wield both divine power and ether, allowing him to use two different energies simultaneously. This is the second time Tezwa has seen such a thing with his own eyes. He's amazed by Louis's connection to multiple gods, noting that he cannot see the god of humans among them, which proves there is something special about Louis. Gilpad suggests they gather for a meal, but Tezwa quickly provokes him, saying he will take good care of everyone. The hunter asks what kind of nonsense he's spouting, admitting his curiosity about everything related to Louis. The mage says it's all over now. Louis isn't a heretic, he's the one who managed to destroy the sealing stone. Gilpad asks why he doesn't leave with everyone, explaining that since the sealing stone disappeared, the monsters have started to dwindle. The mage asks how many are left, and Gilpad replies that in 10 years, they'll be gone. This means that as long as monsters are still there, he must remain in place. Tezwa questions if he's stupid, calling it an opportunity to rejoin the knights. But Gilpad says he'll sell the monsters and make money, though they are soon interrupted by Bior's knights on the road. Gilpad prepares to attack, but they ask him to wait, as they came without the Viscount's knowledge. A hunter emerges from behind the soldiers, saying they bought meat and liquor after regrouping, as they had been saved the last time. They had drunk a little while waiting for Gilpad. The soldier then asks if Gilpad will join them. At the camp, everyone enjoys the night, with Belle asking Jean if he would like to eat too. Louis eats alone until interrupted by Tezwa, who asks if he truly enjoys being by himself. Placing her hand on him, Delrosie asks why the mage has approached him again. But the mage says they're friends who share secrets, and he has an interesting gift. A wanted poster he got from some peasants. Lewis's debt was 8,000, but he was wanted for 6,000, or 20,000 if brought in alive. Gilpod remarks that Lewis must be worth something if he's valued at 20,000. Bell says that kind of money could change lives, but his master asks how Lewis will live freely with such a price on his head. Lewis says he'll take care of it soon, and that he has to pay off a debt first. Gilpod, with a stern tone, asks what Lewis did to accumulate such a massive debt, an almost unbelievable amount of money. Teswa, still surprised by the situation, also questions why Gilpod is so interested in his actions, as if something is being hidden. Gilpod, visibly irritated, orders them both to stop asking the same questions repeatedly, clarifying that it wasn't just Bjor's soldiers gathered there. The local inhabitants themselves, without any explanation, had also joined the group. They were there because, without this help, they all likely would have died, without reason or understanding of what was happening. Gilpod mentions that there are other powerful knights at the royal palace, but those present here are the only ones capable of providing real help. Teswa, still confused, tries to grasp the reasoning behind all this but still can't understand what Gilpod is trying to convey. Lewis, with an ironic smile, observes the scene until he receives a notification, alerting him that restoration is complete and the main mission has begun. With this, he asks Gilpod and Teswa about the mysterious Hara Knight. Hearing the question, Gilpod quickly covers his disciple's mouth, leaving Lewis even more bewildered about what's happening, as his mission was to find the Hara Knight. The master ensures they are the only ones who heard Lewis's words, warning him that he's lucky the others are drinking and talking. He observes the situation around him, where others are distracted, then turns to Lewis with a serious admonition. If anyone had heard what he said, the consequences would have been severe. The tension in the air could have been avoided if those around were paying more attention. He then shifts responsibility to Teswa, suggesting the mage explain what's happening. The mage says he won't tell anyone and remarks that hearing the name in public is rare. Teswa, in a grave tone, confirms he will maintain confidentiality. He explains that it's extremely rare for someone to hear that name publicly, and that alone is reason for serious trouble. He reassures Lewis that the secret is safe among them but warns about the danger that name represents. Lewis pulls away from his master's hand and asks what is wrong with everyone. Lewis, still confused, steps back from his master's hand and, visibly disturbed, questions what's going on. He wants to know if he said something wrong and if that's why the reactions around him were so intense. Gilpod questions how ignorant Lewis could be to speak about such things. Gilpod, with a disapproving look, questions Lewis's ignorance in mentioning something so serious without understanding the implications. He expresses a mix of surprise and frustration at Lewis for speaking about something so grave without proper knowledge. Teswa says that Lewis probably doesn't know, and that they need to explain. Noticing Lewis's confusion, Teswa decides it's best to explain everything from the beginning, assuming Lewis likely has no idea what is happening. He takes the lead to clarify the situation, starting with the basics. Teswa begins with a simple question to gauge how much Lewis already knows about the topic. He asks if Lewis has heard of the three gods who protect humanity. Lewis denies it, but Teswa expected this. Lewis responds negatively, and Teswa, unsurprised, continues with the explanation. He had already anticipated that Lewis might not be familiar with these concepts. He elaborates, starting with the three fundamental gods, Lom, the god of war, Mercila, the goddess of abundance, and Charlotte, the god of order. He emphasizes that these gods united for a decisive battle. These three gods joined forces against the phantom that Lewis mentioned. Teswa explains that the three gods united to face an immense threat, which Lewis referred to as a phantom. This being, however, is a much greater danger, prompting the gods to band together against it. Due to the number of casualties during the war, humanity's enemies became known as demons. The war caused by this threat resulted in such massive losses that the term demons became the standard to describe humanity's enemies. The scale of death and destruction was so vast that this label became widely accepted. Lewis is surprised to hear that they still need to hunt humanity's enemies and asks if this is why the name of the demon cannot be spoken aloud. Teswa says that many scientists have been prosecuted for saying the name aloud. Teswa confirms that due to the severity and risks associated with the name, many scientists and scholars who have mentioned it publicly have been prosecuted. Simply uttering it aloud is considered a serious offense. Lewis says he spoke it, but nothing happened. Trying to understand, Lewis comments that he himself said the name but didn't notice any immediate consequences. He questions why nothing happened to him. The mage scolds him, explaining that consequences don't happen instantly, like death descending from the sky. Teswa corrects Lewis, clarifying that the repercussions aren't immediate, like sudden death. The punishment may not be visible right away, but it's something that lingers and will eventually catch up to those who violate the laws. In any case, if Lewis commits blasphemy by calling the name, he will encounter the executors. Tezwa warns Lewis that if he continues to blaspheme by uttering the name, he will draw the attention of the executors, ruthless individuals tasked with handling such transgressions. These executors are known for their efficiency and brutality. From that point, they will find you if you commit blasphemy. Once activated, the executors have the ability to track and locate anyone who commits such blasphemy, no matter where they are. Every individual reported has been sentenced to death. Tezwa concludes by stating that anyone reported for this transgression has been sentenced to death. The gravity of the offense allows no leniency. Tezwa tells Lewis he is lucky to be sitting with him and Gilpad because if it were anyone else, he would have been reported to the church. Tezwa notes that Lewis is fortunate to be among magi like himself and Gilpad. Otherwise, any other group would have reported him to the church, leading to fatal consequences. Gilpad, curious and slightly irritated, questions why Lewis is so interested in learning about the demon's name, suggesting that his curiosity might be putting him in more danger than he realizes. Lewis insists that he cannot reveal all the details to Gilpad but explains that the reason for locating the mentioned demon is clear and important to him. His master interrupts abruptly, slamming his hand on the table, and demands Tezwa say it's all just a joke. Tezwa responds, contradicting the master, saying it's probably not a joke. Gilpad confirms that Tezwa had no influence on Lewis's words and that the young man made the decision on his own. Lewis then reveals to Gilpad that he has lived his entire life without a defined purpose. However, since encountering the gods through Tezwa, he has realized they seem to have been controlling his life all along. Gilpad, upon hearing this revelation, asks if this control has anything to do with Lewis being able to wield divine powers. Lewis explains that he needs to uncover the truth about what the gods really want from him and that, in the future, he will seek those answers. Gilpad reflects on the boy's words and the implications of his stance, considering what might happen if Lewis were to truly oppose the gods. Tezwa, meanwhile, simply smiles as he watches the conversation unfold. Lewis sighs, signaling the end of the discussion, and declares that this is the summary of his decision. He suggests that perhaps it's time to leave as well. Gilpad remarks that his disciple is stubborn, pointing out that Lewis was the only one who asked permission to stay. He suggests that the boy travel to the Cetria Empire, believing that the place might hold answers about the mentioned demon. Lewis admits he doesn't know what the Cetria Empire is, prompting his master to explain. Gilpad elaborates that about a century ago, the Cetria Empire was founded through an alliance between humans and dragons. He states that Lewis will likely find evidence related to the god of evil there. Delrosi then questions the connection between an empire founded by humans and dragons and the god of evil. Tezwa clarifies that the god of evil is often described as having the appearance of a dragon. He also notes that, unlike the current kingdom, the Cetria Empire holds only a superficial belief in the three human gods. Because of this difference in beliefs, Tezwa concludes that it will be easier for Lewis to investigate the devil in that territory, and if he wants to leave soon, he should get to bed earlier tonight. The next day, Belle is found training while sensing ether in the air. Jean, watching the girl from a distance, remarks that she's quite diligent to be training so early in the morning. Belle says her master and companion insist it's the only way to get stronger quickly. The lazy swordswoman agrees and asks if she has a reason for wanting to be stronger. Melancholically, as she recalls Lewis, Belle says that if she had power, she wouldn't be used by other people. Changing her expression, she comments that she'd like to swing a few swords like Jean and her companion, but instead, she has to take blows every day. Jean draws a sword and says she'll give it to Belle as a gift, as it no longer suits her abilities. Belle is thrilled and holds the sword, asking if she can really use it. Her benefactor assures her, saying she'd be even happier if Belle could wield it well. As Belle imbues ether into the sword, she becomes excited and expresses her gratitude. But soon, the sword begins to crack. Both are stunned, and Belle wonders why the sword simply broke. As Lewis and Gilpad watch the scene from a distance, the mercenary comments that they've become quite close. Gilpad warns that his student probably already knows but reminds him that respecting the operational rules of ether is essential when handling a weapon. Lewis complains that his master keeps repeating the same phrase, saying he's tired of hearing it. Gilpad retorts that he repeats it because it's important, as Lewis would destroy the weapon before even touching his opponent. Lewis notices that Belle used ether, an impressive feat considering how little time had passed since they took her in. Gilpad remarks that she's quite talented and might even be considered a genius. Lewis concludes that it's better this way, as training Belle is more interesting than training himself. His master merely agrees. Before being interrupted by Tezwa, Lewis asks if they're also leaving soon. The mage confirms, stating he's leaving because the food and shelter were too simple for his tastes. Gilpad scolds him, calling him a bastard for taking advantage of the food until now. Tezwa raises his hand and hands an object to Lewis. When questioned, he explains it's a premium client card for the Horian company, something that will be very useful in the future. Gilpad also hands his disciple a bag filled with lightweight but valuable items from beasts. He says Lewis should consider it as a retirement allowance. With a smile, Lewis thanks leader Gilpad and reflects on the 2 months he spent there. 2 months ago, he fought alone, trusting no one. But now, he realizes he's no longer alone. Belle asks if he'll return, and Gilpad assures her it's not a final goodbye. He says Lewis can come back whenever he wants. Lewis thinks that's true but concludes that nothing lasts forever. This day to leave came a little sooner than he expected. As he leaves the village path, a man with wings is shown flying over the forest, watching. The man remarks that darkness will soon return, able to emerge at any time and place. He questions how the sealing stone of the Black Forest disappeared without leaving any accomplishments behind. Then, turning to someone, he demands an explanation about what occurred. The informant responds that something unexpected happened and apologizes, revealing that the man's name is Banaf. Banaf asks if Lewis might be a bearer of divine power. The informant states that they will observe Lewis carefully, as he could become a major obstacle to their plans. When asked where he is headed, Banaf reveals that Lewis will travel to Central Cetria. Revealing her face, the informant comments that this is good since she's tired of dealing with the people of Cetria. Sitting on a throne atop the corpse of a king, she declares that she will allow Lewis to come to her. In the sacred city of the Cetria Empire, Lewis is being pursued by 2 guards. The guards argue among themselves, instructing each other to keep up the chase. Lewis shouts for them to stop pursuing him, questioning why they are outside the castle since they are mere gate guards. He knows the wanted poster is to blame but never imagined that the Cetria Empire, a foreign nation, would be so well informed about his presence. Seeing guards abandon their posts to capture a single man deeply irritates him. He begins to question whether he should kill the guards but quickly remembers Gilpad and decides it would be unnecessary since killing them wouldn't solve the problem. The guards continue their pursuit, shouting about the reward they'll receive. Lewis, indignant, thinks the guards are lucky he hasn't killed them yet. As he runs through the city streets, he notices some demonic beasts attacking carriages and merchants. One merchant, shouting, begs for all the cargo to be left behind. Lewis wonders why there are so many beasts near the central city. After all, they're attacking merchants right in the middle of the city. While fleeing, a merchant falls to the ground, begging to be left alone, but his plea is interrupted by a knight armed with a sword. Lewis observes the scene and thinks that if the Cetria army were aware of the situation, these beasts would have already been subdued. The knight, after saving the merchant, comments that the merchant was unlucky to encounter a beast but lucky to have found someone like him to help. Relieved, the merchant thanks the knight and promises to pay him if he can protect the cargo in good condition. Lewis, watching the scene, notices the guards complaining about being in the city now. They grumble about needing to return to the castle before facing severe punishment. Meanwhile, another guard mutters about having to abandon 20,000 coins. Lewis wonders what's wrong with the Cetria army. A hooded man, cutting down the beasts, tries attacking their shoulders, but the beasts regenerate quickly. He ends up being killed, murmuring that he didn't know about the creature's regeneration ability. The merchant, terrified, flees, saying he thought the hooded man could handle the beasts. He offers a large sum of money to anyone willing to help, but Lewis, determined not to draw attention, chooses not to get involved. He recalls Gilpad's words about not judging people based on utility, and in the blink of an eye, the beast's head is severed. With an agile movement, Lewis eliminates all the demonic beasts attacking. He then lands on the ground after defeating them, remarking that for each monster he killed, he earned about 40 hours. He thinks it's a bit less than the beasts in the Black Forest, but still valuable. A merchant approaches Lewis, asking if he was the one who saved everyone. She introduces herself as Leia, a branch manager of the Horian company. As she begins to talk about the Empire and a potential contract, Lewis interrupts her. He says he's willing to do what she wants but only wants his share for the help he provided. The remaining hunters try to question Lewis, saying he killed the beasts without having the right to do so. They argue that they lost allies during the battle and that Lewis only appeared to eliminate the monsters. Leia calmly explains that, according to regulations, whoever slays the monster with their sword holds the rights to it. She observes that if the hunters had slain the beasts, she could determine how much they contributed to the battle. One of the soldiers attempts to cut the monster but can't even scratch its skin. Leia thanks him and invites the next one to try. The soldier, exhausted, tries to justify that he's worn out, but Lewis, impatient, pierces the beast with his sword and etheric energy. Lewis asks if this is enough to prove that the soldiers truly deserve the reward. He asserts that the winner should take everything and says he doesn't mind if both of them come after him. The soldiers, embarrassed, turn around and begin to leave. Leia, without further ado, tosses a bag of coins to them, saying that although they didn't kill the beasts, they still helped. She adds that without the allies' sacrifices, everyone likely would have been killed before they could fight back. The soldiers, with nothing else to say, thank her and depart. Louis, not understanding the reason for the reward, asks Leia why she did that. Leia responds that the greatest value for the Horian company is credit. She explains that if they hadn't been rewarded, they might not help next time. Louis recognizes the logic and agrees with her. Curious, Leia asks for Louis's name and if she can assist him with anything else. Louis introduces himself as Louis Delrosi and, pulling out the object given by Tezwa, reveals that he received it from someone. Leia recognizes the object as a mark of someone of high rank and asks how she can help him with it. Louis explains that he wants to go to Santa Cetria but is currently a wanted man. He asks if Leia can assist him. Leia is surprised by this information and, concerned, asks if he truly wishes to go to Santa Cetria. She warns that, given the current situation, it is unwise as the country is becoming a ruined place. Meanwhile, in Santa Cetria, the informant from earlier is seated on a throne. She, along with the king, listens to complaints about the demon beasts at the gates and the citizens who have become fugitive soldiers, desperate for safety. However, the zombified king breaks the arm of a man still pleading for help. He speaks about the army's rapid reduction, something on the queen's agenda to promote peace in Cetria. With a look of pure rage, he declares the man a traitor. The king's face is completely distorted, a lifeless, soulless body but with unwavering certainty that Cetria is unbeatable. It had been a long time since the Cetria Empire was effectively governed. The once prosperous nation was now neglected in every way, as though it had fallen into a deep, endless abyss. Cetria's official currency, the Cetrian, had practically lost its value in the market. Desperate to conduct any kind of transaction, people faced humiliating situations, struggling to exchange the empire's currency for anything still holding value. It was a clear reflection of the empire's financial collapse. The guards, once responsible for the kingdom's safety and establishments, had become useless. Crimes, once minor thefts or disputes, had become increasingly severe and violent. Yet no one was doing anything to change the situation. Outside the royalty, the empire was nothing more than a distant memory. At the kingdom's entrance, Leia was with her carriage, ready to face the next challenge. The carriage was about to be inspected, but before anything could happen, she tossed a bag of coins to the guards on duty. The guards, upon seeing the offering, immediately abandoned any inspection, allowing her to pass without objection. With a calm smile, Leia remarked to Louis that with a little trust, many things could be easily resolved. Louis, for his part, thanked her but said he didn't need Leia's help at the moment. He then, with a serious expression, remarked that he would contact her another time. Leia, with subtle irony, said it was nothing to do that for someone who had saved her life. Louis, unshaken, recalled the reason he was there, asking Leia where he could seek information about God. Leia, without hesitation, replied that the best place for that would be a temple. Louis, however, thought quickly and realized that discussing the Hara Night, there wouldn't be possible. He then asked if there was another option, and Leia, in a softer tone, suggested that the second best option would be a library. Louis, with a curious look, asked what exactly a library was. Leia, with patience, explained that a library was a place where books were stored, a place of great knowledge. Louis already knew what a library was but had no idea that such a place would exist in Cetria. Still filled with questions, Louis asked if it would be possible to trade the materials he had collected from the beasts of the Black Forest for money, as he needed that amount for something important. At the Merchant Guild of Cetria, Louis once again found himself in an uncomfortable situation. He approached a group of mercenaries and told them that he was only there to settle a debt, and, in doing so, get off the wanted list. However, one of the mercenaries, with a cynical smile, questioned whether Louis had lost his mind. It was far more profitable to claim the bounty for capturing him alive than simply allowing him to pay the debt. Louis, without losing his composure, said that if that was their plan, they should try to kill him without hesitation. If they wanted a fight, he would give them one, but in the end, anyone who drew their sword would be killed. Before the confrontation could escalate, the bald man, whom Louis already knew, interrupted the discussion. He made a pertinent observation about the wanted poster, highlighting that the reward was 20,000 gold coins for capturing Louis alive. Louis then began to understand the situation and recognized that the reason for his capture alive was not just for the immediate reward but also to extract more money, possibly due to the influence of noble families or powerful countries. The bald man called Louis by name, and the young man immediately recognized the familiar voice. The bald man then explained that he was there to settle Louis's debt, which amounted to 8,000 imperial coins. Louis, without hesitation, paid the debt and asked if, with this, the wanted poster would be annulled. The bald man, however, revealed that he still owed much more than that since the real person responsible for the bounty was someone who wanted Louis captured. The debt had grown to 6,580 gold coins, and because of that, he was still on the wanted list. Louis, enraged, asked who had placed such a high value on his head. The bald man, with a tone of disdain, explained that the mercenary guild charged a 30% interest rate every month, which drastically increased the debt. Louis, outraged, questioned how such a thing could be allowed, suggesting there should be a limit to interest rates, but the mercenaries were not interested in discussing that. The bald man explained that the kingdom of Cetria was bankrupt, with massive debts owed to various industries and mercenary guilds. Even the powerful Horian industry no longer had enough gold to sustain its operation. He suggested to Louis that he consider depreciation, fees, and transportation, which significantly reduced the value of selling materials. Louis, angry and confused, knew he was in a desperate situation. Then the bald man handed him the next mission, to capture a long-term guest at the Light Inn, in room 201. Louis, although skeptical, quickly accepted the mission, determined to resolve everything at once. He entered the inn and went straight to the indicated room. But before entering, he was greeted by a punch thrown by a woman with a scar on her face. Louis, with agility, dodged the blow and thought to himself that the woman seemed well trained, as her movements were quick and precise. He told her that her attack had not hit him and that there was a colossal difference between their skills. Suddenly, a second woman attacked Louis stealthily, but he stopped her with ease, saying that even if she were the wife or daughter of the first woman, she was still far from his level. The girl, furious, shouted, asking who he was calling daughter, claiming her body was just small. After a loud laugh, she said she was checking whether he really was a good mercenary and that, finally, they had sent someone competent. Louis, curious, questioned her about the mercenary guild, but the girl replied that she had sent a request that very day and, as a result, they had sent someone talented like Louis. Louis pondered how the bald man, who had previously guided him, had deceived him with his words. He remembered well what the bald man had said, mentioning that they had probably met before. Louis then replied that his only goal was to complete the mission and receive payment for it. However, the girl stated that mercenaries only understood the language of money, and for that reason, she was willing to give him as much as he wanted. She made that promise in the name of Sirier Downey Cetria. Louis, upon hearing the name, quickly thought that with the surname Cetria, she was probably part of the royal family. He, with a bit of reverence, said it was an honor to meet someone from royalty. But with a mix of anger and frustration, he turned to the other woman and declared he was leaving at that moment. The princess, surprised by Louis's attitude, questioned how reckless he could be to turn his back on her. The other woman, noticing the tension, asked Louis to wait, as Princess Sirier had not yet finished speaking. Louis, sighing, decided it was better to hear what she had to say rather than cause more problems. So, he asked why someone of noble blood wanted to hire such a humble mercenary as himself. The princess, without hesitation, asked if Louis had ever heard of Josephine. He, confused, said he hadn't. Sirier continued, explaining that Josephine was the evil queen who had caused the country's downfall. She then asked Louis to help her kill the evil queen. Louis, shocked, replied that it was a matter for the imperial family and that he had no right to interfere. The princess insisted, saying he must have already heard about it. She began telling the story of the empire, which, though small, was founded by dragons and humans hundreds of years ago. It was a country that valued equality and social respect for all its inhabitants, regardless of class. The king, Sirier's father, created a nation where everyone was treated with dignity. Even the palace guards would offer flowers to the king on his birthday, as a gesture of deep respect. The king always responded to everyone with love and affection. But even as king, he had someone he loved more than himself. It was Queen Josephine, his wife, who once placed a rose behind the king's ear and asked why he didn't wear the rose instead of the crown. Those were truly happy times, but everything changed when Queen Josephine fell ill and passed away, leaving everyone suddenly in endless mourning. The king, devastated by the loss, fell into a state of despair. Louis, hearing all of that, questioned the princess why she wanted to kill someone who was already dead. He also asked what kind of mission was being assigned to him. Sirier's guard, noticing Louis's confusion, explained that the true story began at that point. Days after the queen's funeral, Josephine suddenly appeared before the king. That alone was unusual, as the dead didn't usually return to life. The new Josephine was entirely different from the woman he had known, yet she had the same name, the same voice, and the same face. Her warm touch and captivating scent caused the king to lose his mind, becoming obsessed with her. The king began living only for her, forgetting his kingdom and his responsibilities. And one day, he handed control of the kingdom to Josephine, killing anyone who opposed her. With the king's support, Josephine's reign continued, with her taking over the reins of the empire. Louis, realizing the gravity of the situation, said it was all very complicated. And with two questions, he began questioning the princess. First, he asked why she was telling the entire story while lying on a bed. The princess, somewhat flustered, replied that he was staring at her as she spoke. His second question was why she needed his help, as, being a princess, she should have enough reasons to handle everything on her own. The princess, visibly confused, said the nobles were on Josephine's side. Her guard, however, asked if that really mattered to Louis, as from his point of view, money should be the best reason. Louis, with an ironic smile, said mercenaries don't think only about money. They fight for money, but they risk their lives. That's why they don't sell their lives for suicide missions. Louis didn't care if Josephine was good or evil, but if what the princess said was true, he needed to be convinced that he could win. Otherwise, he would leave. Cyrier, determined, asked him to wait and questioned if he didn't care about the country's future. Louis replied that he didn't care what happened, turning to leave. But Cyrier's guard stopped him, asking him to sit down since the princess wouldn't repeat her words. Louis, enraged, said he understood her loyalty but insisted she needed to learn how to choose her opponents more wisely. If she was so confident she could face him, she should draw her sword. Otherwise, he would defeat her easily, just like the last time. He turned to leave, but his thoughts were confused and irritated. He knew he had wasted time since he had neither a plan nor information about his opponent. The princess's head, filled with good intentions and flowers, seemed as naive as a child's. Louis was not interested in good deeds or noble causes. All of this made him reflect on how irritating and frustrating it was to deal with that bald man and his manipulations. Louis decided to focus on his main mission, which was still to locate the Hara Knight. For that, he would need to head to the royal library, as Leia had suggested. When he arrived at Cetria's royal library, Louis was surprised to sense magic in the air. He wondered what it was, noticing a semi-transparent boundary before him. Then, he realized he was standing before a magical barrier. Even though it was the royal library, he hadn't expected such drastic measures to prevent entry. Louis was still trying to understand how that world functioned. He began to look for people nearby. It was clear that this world was a stratified society, where methods for growing strong and learning martial arts were passed down within families and clans. Knowledge, on the other hand, was controlled by nobles to prevent the lower classes from becoming more intelligent. The library guarding this knowledge was a fortress of information. For that reason, it didn't have weak security. Attempting to break the barrier with an attack, Louis found it didn't budge an inch. Frustrated, he began searching for other libraries. But no matter how far he walked, he seemed to stay in the same place. Then, as he looked at the library, a door opened, and the barrier vanished. Louis, realizing what had happened, told himself that it probably wanted him to be there, and he wondered if everything would be all right. After entering the library, Louis was met with silence and the vastness of the place. He was the only one there, and the library stretched across multiple floors, filled with shelves laden with books that seemed to disappear into the endless expanse. He was surprised by the lack of any kind of reception. Aloud, he complained about the negligence, mentioning that they could at least offer him a cup of tea or a gesture of courtesy. Surprisingly, a voice responded, calm and unshaken. The voice explained that, indeed, everyone visiting for the first time reacted the same way. However, the reason they were there was what set them apart. The library, it said, was not just a place for anyone but a refuge for those with specific intentions. Louis, still suspicious, looked around, feeling uneasy yet curious. He asked if the man who had responded to him knew more, rather than being just another random visitor. The blond man who approached him introduced himself calmly. Louis noticed that even with the vast number of books and the knowledge stored there, he was standing before something incomparable to Earth. The sheer volume and quality of the knowledge there seemed superior. With a slight smile, Louis asked the man if, by chance, there were books about the gods there, and if possible, information about the god of evil, a name that echoed intensely in his mind. The man, apparently intrigued, said he initially thought Louis was just another stranger trying to exploit the library, given the chaotic state of the world. However, he now seemed genuinely interested. With a swift movement, the man approached Louis, who began to wonder how he had managed to get so close without being noticed. In a quick gesture, the man drew a sword and placed it between them. He explained that before they continued talking, it would be better to set aside any potentially dangerous equipment. Louis, surprised, observed the scene. Suddenly, a tea table appeared in front of him, as if the library itself were preparing the setting for their conversation. The man, in a casual tone, said that since Louis had asked for a cup of tea, they could now begin their discussion. Louis realized that this man was not an ordinary individual but a sorcerer of great power. He felt a slight pressure in the air around them, indicating the presence of magic. The man then proposed an agreement. They would answer each other's questions while the hourglass was running. Louis, cautious, understood that this conversation could have serious consequences if he wasn't careful. He feels that his life might be at risk if he isn't honest. As soon as the hourglass starts counting time, the man asks, without hesitation, how Lewis knew the name of the god of evil. Lewis, with calculated calm, responds that he had a revelation and that he is therefore seeking Bahara. He then asks where he could find the path to meet her. The man, for a moment, observes Lewis in silence. He replies in a deeper tone, saying that he disliked how humans referred to the gods as God of Evil. To him, there were no good or evil gods, only allies and enemies. And to find Bahara, Lewis would need 2 items, a sacred object and a specific temple. Lewis, attentive, asks where he could find this sacred object and the temple's location. The man explains that the sacred object is in Cetria, and the temple is located in the north of the Trojan Empire. However, he adds that due to the current situation, he does not know where Bahara is, as she has lost her body. Intrigued, Lewis asks if this means Bahara is dead. The man confirms that, indeed, she is no longer the god of evil as humans know her. Bahara rebelled against Charlotte, the god of humanity, and was defeated. The man then reveals that he doesn't know what happened to her after the battle but believes she lost her powers. Lewis, even more curious, asks for the man's name, and he reveals himself to be a sorcerer. But before he can continue, Lewis, already suspicious, interrupts him. He questions why the man speaks of Bahara so intimately, almost as if he had lived the story himself. The sorcerer, somewhat disconcerted, tries to divert the conversation, but Lewis, determined, demands clear answers. The sorcerer, for his part, doesn't hide anything but says the conversation will have to continue another time since the hourglass's time has run out. He mentions that the next time they meet, the conversation will have no limits. However, he also suggests that Lewis follow the official route to solve the matter, and before anything else, bids him farewell with an enigmatic smile. Lewis, with the information still fresh in his mind, leaves the library. As he walks through the streets of Cetria, he questions what really happened and what lay behind the sorcerer's evasive answers. He knows he is closer to finding Bahara, but something is still unclear in his mind. Suddenly, he is approached by guards who question his presence there. Lewis, calmly, explains that he was just leaving the library. The guards, however, don't believe him, as no one could enter there without the royal family's permission. He begins to realize that the sorcerer had somehow involved him in something much bigger than he imagined. When confronted by the guards, Lewis recalls the sorcerer's words about following the official route. This means he must have some form of permission to be there, and the only person powerful enough to grant him that permission is Princess Cyria, who immediately comes to his mind. Raising his hands in a gesture of surrender, Lewis tries to withdraw, but the guards do not allow it. One of the officers, drawing his sword, approaches, and Lewis, with a sigh, prepares for a confrontation. He didn't want to do this, but he knew his self-control was being tested. He warns that he does not intend to kill anyone, only defend himself. Before the conflict can escalate, a figure appears, interrupting the fight. Princess Cyria's guard introduces herself as Emma and reveals that the princess has granted permission for Lewis to be released. The guards, reluctantly, accept Emma's decision, though one officer still expresses discontent. Lewis, relieved, thanks Emma for intervening, but she advises him to thank the princess. The mercenary then comments that he was eager to speak with the princess anyway. In a leap, Cyria appears on top of a house, observing the scene with an amused smile. She mentions that it wasn't as though they were following Lewis, but rather they found him in trouble and took the opportunity to act. Lewis, still confused by the situation, knows that now, more than ever, he needs to settle the score and continue his mission. He thanks the princess, acknowledging that she is indeed a key figure in his ability to access the library and obtain the answers he seeks. At home, the princess remarks that it was a wise decision for Lewis to cooperate with them. She calls him simply Lewis and states that he is welcome. The young man remarks that it's petty to make such a request but questions whether it was necessary to say that while standing on the bed. The princess simply orders him to shut up. Lewis thinks that her first command was for him to stay quiet. After the conversation, the princess asks about the library pass. She mentions that it won't be hard to obtain it once everything is settled but wants to know why he recently tried to sneak into the library. Lewis reflects that even if he told the truth, she probably wouldn't believe him. He then explains that it was all a misunderstanding and that he was merely looking for something. The young man hopes this explanation will be enough to prevent her from discovering his true plan. The princess quickly asks if he isn't one of those fools searching for the dragon rumored to live in the library. Surprised, Lewis asks what she's talking about. She explains that there's a rumor about a dragon hidden in the library's halls. For a mercenary like him, who apparently prioritized money, nothing besides a legend about a dragon would be of interest. Fortunately, she was mistaken. Even so, Lewis decides he will soon take some action regarding the princess. During the night, Lewis decides to make something clear. He states that, even in the midst of a rebellion, he won't risk his life fighting for them. He explains that facing royal troops isn't just about defeating opponents. The consequences would be severe, as they would become enemies of an entire kingdom and face constant danger within the country. The princess listens attentively and responds that she understands his point of view. She acknowledges that it's unfair to ask such a thing from a foreign mercenary. However, she reminds him that she's already explained they don't have enough strength to prepare for other eventualities. She makes it clear she isn't asking him to fight, only to become a strategic obstacle. Louis thinks that her words sound like an attempt at resignation. He questions whether just the three of them could possibly kill the evil queen. The princess slams the table, asserting that they cannot. She explains that, besides her brother also shares the same goal and will be involved in the plan. Before she can say more, Emma interrupts, warning that someone might be listening. Louis silently agrees, thinking that in such a situation, security should be a priority. Even so, he finds it curious that the princess has confided everything to her brother, still a child. This makes him doubt whether the plan will actually succeed. The princess concludes by saying the plan will begin in 4 days. She asks Louis to simply protect her and not go overboard with his actions. Before leaving, she mentions that sleeping is essential for growing strong. Louis says he'll be in the room next door, and that she just needs to call if she needs anything. As he leaves the room, Syria asks Emma to rest. However, Emma decides to test something before sleeping and heads outside, where she finds Louis. She calls him Louis Del Rossi, the soul collector. Louis asks sarcastically if that's all she has to say. Emma reveals that she checked his history with the mercenary guild. She mentions that he has an impressive record and is suspected of having single-handedly annihilated an entire group of mercenaries. Louis, unfazed, asks if she really came just to bother him while he was washing his face. He questions what she intends to do there. Emma explains that it's nothing personal and challenges him to a duel. She wants to confirm if he's truly worthy of the princess's trust. Emma emphasizes that, even though the princess believes in him, she doesn't share that view. Moreover, she mentions that the Blue Dragon Cavalry, a symbol of Cetria, will also join the cause. She highlights that the leader of this cavalry is General Caesar, a veteran of the Holy War. Louis, unimpressed, comments that Caesar is just another man from the Holy War. Emma insists that, despite that, Louis needs to prove his worth. She challenges him, and Louis accepts, suggesting a duel without the use of ether. He allows Emma to make the first move, stating that if she falls, she'll lose. Emma swiftly advances with a thrust, but Louis easily blocks it. The princess, watching from a distance, comments that it looks like an intense interaction between knights through their swords. She wonders how strong a northern mercenary truly is. Louis, meanwhile, is surprised by Emma's weakness. He thinks that if she represents the strength of Cetria's knights, then they are in terrible shape. With a single strike, Emma falls to the ground, defeated. Louis looks at her and asks if that's the best cavalry Cetria can offer. He remarks that, with this level, it'll be difficult to negotiate or achieve anything significant. Meanwhile, in another place, Josephine was confronting the prince and making comments similar to Louis's. Caesar stood beside her, observing the fallen knights. He warned that attacking the rightful heir of Cetria was a risk. Josephine, undaunted, confronted the prince. She asked if he truly believed he could stand against her. The prince, enraged, promised to cut off her head and display it in the square. Josephine retorted, saying that all of this was the result of his greed for the throne. She claimed that he was blinded by ambition and that it would lead Cetria to ruin. The prince insisted that everything he did was for the good of the kingdom. Josephine stared at him and asked if he truly believed that, or if his greed was purely self-serving. At home, the princess questioned Emma about how they had lost contact with her brother. Emma replied that she was trying to figure out what had happened. But it wasn't just the crown prince. Everyone involved in the battle had vanished. None of them could be found since the previous midnight. Syria said it was too early to draw conclusions. Emma suggested they move to a new location first. However, they were soon interrupted by a noise coming from outside. The princess asked what it was, only to see hundreds of people gathered in front of the palace. They all proclaimed that the kingdom was already doomed to disaster. Since the Horan industry had left, obtaining food had become difficult. Not only that, but a few days ago, a peasant's sister had been killed by thieves. They said they couldn't just wait for death, so they had no choice but to become thieves themselves. They declared that a child like Syria shouldn't lead them. Syria, hooded, replied that she was not a child. She said she had heard that there were some people in the palace opposing Josephine. However, a villager questioned her about the rumors that nearby villagers were discussing. The princess said they were probably waiting a bit longer, but the villagers asked what would change if Josephine disappeared. They argued that the royal family was no longer worthy. They claimed the nobility was only interested in their own power. After all, they had ignored the deaths of people like them, so no one there could stand idle any longer. They would rather burn than wait for death. The princess thought this was troubling, as Josephine wouldn't be the only one to disappear. People were now thinking this way. But Emma said they needed to get their heads straight after taking things more seriously. Sirius stated that she would accompany them to see what they wanted and, if bloodshed occurred, she would need Emma's help. The guard merely nodded. At the Cetrian palace, civilians confronted guards at the eastern entrance. A guard stated that they couldn't solve the problem because of that man. He said it was all part of the procedure. But a villager retorted that procedures didn't matter since, if they followed them, half the people here would die of hunger. The princess considered their luck in keeping the conversation verbal for now. But soon, a villager demanded they summon the king or provide food from the palace. A knight appeared, asking what was happening, as he said he had heard something unusual. He introduced himself as Maxwell, vice captain of the Blue Dragon Cavalry. Sirius said she had heard of him before, as he was Caesar's apprentice. But Emma explained that, unlike her, Maxwell was incredibly talented. He had studied in the Trojan Empire. He was the youngest man in history to achieve that position. She had also heard he was full of confidence, unaware that something bad might happen. But a scream was heard from the stage. Maxwell said he had come there to see the king and learn about Cetria's situation. But he asked why the villagers had brought so many people to threaten the guards. As he spoke, he sliced off a man's arm with his sword. He told the villagers to stop whining and asked if they knew how many people like them had approached the palace. He questioned whether any king had ever prioritized communicating with the people. That was why Cetria was in such a state, because the royal family was above the law. The villagers couldn't be arrogant just because the royals had been kind before. This was their final warning to leave, or else, they would all be arrested with no chance of escape. A soldier asked Maxwell to stop, saying it was too much. How could a knight raise his sword against a civilian? But Maxwell cut the soldier in half. He declared that disobeying orders was reason enough for execution, and he would consider people like that as siding with the villagers and having malicious intentions. Therefore, this was enough time for them to think. He asked if they all intended to stay there with such intentions. The young man commands the guards to arrest everyone, and to kill if necessary. Everyone begins to flee, and just as Syria is about to reveal herself, she is carried away by the crowd fleeing from the soldiers. She is pushed further away, and a heavy body falls on top of her. A man, already dead, with a deep cut on his shoulder. The girl crawls out from under the body and reflects that this isn't what she wanted. She feels she should stop them, but she doesn't know how, until a hand touches her shoulder. Frightened, she pulls away, but it's only Louis. He asks her what she is doing there. Syria questions how long he's been there, but the young man says he has been following her from the start. And things like this make his shift annoying. He tells her she should stand up and get out of the area first. But Syria says she can't because she has to stop this. Louis asks how they plan to stop it. Even though she doesn't know, the princess insists she will do something. Louis thinks about how she acts without a plan. He says it would be easy if he just killed the soldiers. Syria disagrees, saying they are still people. But Louis points out there are many things she doesn't like, yet she has no specific plan. So he doesn't have many options. He tells the princess to follow him because he has a plan. Meanwhile, Emma, searching for her in the crowd, sees only her hood lying on the ground. But a voice shouts from a rooftop, ordering everyone to stop, and the soldiers to drop their weapons. It's Louis, holding the princess as a hostage. He warns that if they move an inch, they'll see the princess's head roll. Maxwell watched in disbelief at how daring Louis was to take the princess hostage, showing no fear at all. Before he could finish his sentence, Louis, in a swift motion, took a knife and cut his own arm, pretending he had slashed the princess's neck. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Everyone was shocked and horrified by Louis's gesture, questioning how bold he could be to harm the princess. Emma, still stunned by the scene, remarked that Louis would have to bear the consequences of his actions. Maxwell, in a firm tone, ordered everyone to move, making it clear they needed to act. Meanwhile, the villagers, taking advantage of the soldiers' distraction, began to flee rapidly. Louis then asked, in a defiant tone, if that solved the problem. But to everyone's surprise, Syria began to speak. She directly addressed Maxwell, questioning whether he truly believed that killing his own colleagues and civilians in the name of imperial family honor was a way to preserve his own honor. She denied it, asserting that Maxwell's actions were, in fact, an insult to the royal family itself. Before she could continue, Louis pulled her away, cutting her speech short. He questioned what she thought she was doing by acting as a hostage, pointing out that he even cut his own arm to create the necessary atmosphere for the situation. Syria apologized, but Maxwell, irritated, complained that he was trying to preserve the honor of someone who had been stupidly taken hostage. Soon, the guards noticed Emma in the crowd. Maxwell seized the opportunity, seeing her as the perfect scapegoat for the situation. He shouted at Emma, questioning how she could have neglected the princess, allowing things to spiral out of control. Maxwell criticized Emma's competence, declaring that she wasn't qualified to be the princess's guard and ordered her arrest. He publicly accused Emma of neglecting her responsibilities, tarnishing her reputation. When Emma tried to argue and asked him to wait, Maxwell interrupted her, saying he didn't want to hear her excuses. He decrees that, from that moment on, Emma's position as a guard was revoked. Emma tries to resist, saying he has no authority to give such orders, but Maxwell challenges her, asking if she would ignore the command of a superior. He further adds that, due to the additional offense of mutiny, she should be arrested right then and there. Maxwell then slaps Emma across the face, humiliating her publicly in front of the crowd. The princess, seeing Emma being humiliated, cries out in despair, searching for her in the crowd. She wonders how Emma could have failed to escape during the chaos, but soon the villagers approach and grab her, starting to surround her. The villagers, furious, accuse her of being the princess, responsible for the death of their loved ones and the misery of her people. Syria, enraged, demands to know who these men think they are to touch her, but the villagers, consumed by anger, reveal that one of their elder brothers died because of the royal family's actions. They claim the royal family abandoned its people, and for that, the princess is no longer worthy of being served and must pay for all they have suffered. With knives in hand, they threaten to kill the princess. Syria, desperate, questions what they are doing, but one of the villagers holding a knife responds that he wants to see the color of royal blood. Before he can make a move, Louis intervenes, punching the villager with great force and knocking him down. Another villager, still holding the princess, demands to know who Louis is and if he was the one who took the princess hostage. Louis, with a sarcastic smile, responds that from the moment the princess hired him, she should obey him and stop causing trouble. He adds that if the princess hadn't run off on her own without notifying the guards, it wouldn't have been so hard to find her. While he's speaking, one of the villagers attempts to strike him from behind with a piece of wood. Louis, however, quickly turns around, and the wooden stick breaks before it even touches him. He glares at the villagers and, with an irritated expression, says they should be grateful that someone like him saved their lives instead of crossing the line. Drawing his sword, Louis threatens the villagers, but the princess stops him, pleading for him not to point his sword at innocent people. Louis, visibly annoyed, asks why he's even holding the sword but, seeing the princess's anguished expression, sighs and apologizes. He wraps her in his cloak and leads her to safety. On the way, he reflects on how he almost lost control, impulsively drawing his sword, but the princess, like a true sovereign, maintained her composure and dignity. When they arrive home, the princess locks herself in her room, leaving Louis perplexed. He knocks on the door and asks why she locked herself in, but she doesn't respond. Louis, slightly frustrated, remarks that mercenaries like him have additional value every time their contracts are extended. The princess, in turn, apologizes and says she has many things to think about, asking to be left alone. Louis reluctantly agrees, telling her she knows where to find him if she needs anything. Behind the door, the princess cries, asking herself where everything went wrong. She laments because, deep down, she only wanted things to return to the way they were before, the Cetria of the past, and believed the people shared that vision. But now, after everything that happened, she realizes that the people are filled with anger and hatred. The princess fears she has been too weak to handle the situation and continues to question where it all began to go wrong. She feels as though no one is on her side at that moment, not her father, her mother, nor Emma. Louis, on the other hand, thinks the princess is a bit delicate, but in the history of Cetria, people with soft hearts like hers don't have happy endings. He wonders where Emma might be, as it wouldn't make sense for someone with either abilities to be hurt in the crowd. Louis reflects on the situation, questioning why he's thinking about irrelevant matters when his main goal is to complete the system mission without getting involved with the princess. He briefly considers switching sides and joining Josephine, but quickly dismisses the idea, remembering the painful past he endured. Instead, he decides to focus on positive thoughts. Deep down, he believes that, at some point, he was like the princess, someone in whom others placed their hopes. As he's lost in thought, someone approaches him, asking if he's hiding there. It's Maxwell, who reveals that he sent a search team to locate the protesters but started to wonder if Louis, the princess, and the protesters were all on the same side. Louis, drawing his sword, says that Maxwell arrived just in time for him to clear his mind. Maxwell also draws his sword and, in a challenging tone, asks how Louis and his side intend to act. Louis calmly questions what side Maxwell is referring to. Maxwell responds, explaining that, as he mentioned before, he sent a team to hunt down the protesters, using mercenaries to threaten Louis and offering rewards for capturing the fugitives. Maxwell also notes that security in Cetria has become unstable due to the recent conflicts. He warns that when mercenaries and civilians clash physically, there will be casualties. Then, Maxwell attempts a powerful aerial strike at Louis, a blow strong enough to force Louis to retreat. Louis thinks that Maxwell likely captured Emma, which means he still has some sense of honor. Maxwell, on the other hand, says Louis doesn't need to worry because, after everything that has happened, he will be instrumental in rebuilding Cetria. Lewis sarcastically thanks Maxwell for saving him the trouble, stating that he is not worthy of causing another death in this situation. Delrosie closely observes Maxwell and notices that he is using a shield while manipulating ether. This detail catches her attention, as only one school of swordsmanship employs such a technique. With an aggressive movement, Maxwell advances toward Lewis, aiming for a quick thrust. Lewis, however, blocks the attack using ether, demonstrating quick reflexes and a solid stance. Despite his defense, he feels the impact of the shield, which seems to deflect his sword, making it harder to counterattack. While adjusting his blade's trajectory, Lewis decides to change strategy, attacking from the opposite side. Even so, his sword again strikes Maxwell's well-positioned shield, repelling the blow. The force of the impact forces Lewis to retreat, avoiding Maxwell's next strike. Maxwell seizes the moment to speak, boasting about his technique. He explains that the behemoth defense is the foundation of one of the 4 great schools of swordsmanship, something rarely seen. Lewis shows no emotion, but his bandages begin to unravel, revealing something unexpected on his shoulder. Maxwell notices the stigma etched on Lewis's skin, and his expression shifts to surprise. He immediately questions how a mere mercenary could possess something so symbolic and unique. Lewis, in a casual tone, reveals that the symbol is the stigma of Croyd swordsmanship, known as the Sword of Electricity. Maxwell tries to maintain his composure, though it's evident that the stigma has unsettled him. He analyzes Lewis's attacks and concludes that, despite the symbol, his techniques appear simple. Maxwell believes he can win by identifying possible weaknesses in Lewis's posture and combat style. With this strategy in mind, he launches a series of attacks, alternating between quick advances and direct strikes. Lewis, staying calm, closes in again, delivering consecutive blows against Maxwell's shield. The constant impacts begin to test the shield's durability, but Maxwell responds with a confident smile. He asserts that Lewis is limited by an incomplete stigma, which explains his basic approach. As he speaks, Maxwell recalls past duels against the Duke of Croyd's niece. Those encounters made him familiar with the mark he now recognizes on Lewis's arm. He concludes that Lewis cannot fully utilize Croyd's swordsmanship due to the unfinished stigma. Before Maxwell can finish his thought, he is interrupted by a rapid and precise sequence of strikes from Lewis. Maxwell begins to question how much strength Lewis can muster even without fully utilizing the stigma. Lewis, in turn, takes advantage of the opening to criticize Maxwell, saying he relies too much on techniques and lacks a solid foundation. Lewis declares that he would typically slit his throat right there but decides to consult the princess before acting. Syria hesitates, visibly shaken, saying she doesn't want to harm Maxwell since he is a citizen of Cetria. Lewis, annoyed by her indecision, mocks her stance and decides to make the decision himself. He stares directly at Maxwell, asking if he has any last wishes before dying. Maxwell, realizing his disadvantage, tries to manipulate the situation by questioning the princess. He insinuates that hiring a mercenary to kill a knight is dishonorable and a reflection of her hypocrisy. Before Maxwell can continue, Lewis brutally interrupts him, slitting his throat without hesitation. Maxwell's head falls to the ground, and the princess, horrified, recoils, staring at the scene with wide eyes. She collapses to the floor, trying to crawl away, while Lewis watches her coldly. He asks if her fear comes from the violent scene or a sense of guilt for her indecision. Syria, still shaken, admits that she is tired of believing that good intentions alone are enough to solve everything. She acknowledges that her naive approach was a form of hypocrisy, and that it isn't working. Lewis picks her up over his shoulder, ignoring her protests, and screams to be let down. He questions why she's in a bad mood when there are still bigger problems to solve. Lewis mentions that, according to Maxwell, the fleeing protesters are being hunted by mercenaries. Syria seems surprised to hear this, but Lewis insists that the choice is now simple. He asks if she would choose to abandon or save her subjects, leaving the responsibility in her hands. The princess responds that she would always save her people, even if they had tried to kill her before. Lewis observes her curiously, reflecting on her values and comparing her to his former mentor, Gilpad. He realizes that Syria still needs guidance and decides to help her grow. Lewis proposes an agreement. She should ask for help whenever she feels uncertain and stop carrying everything on her own. The princess accepts the proposal and thanks him for his patience and support. Meanwhile, in the city, the pursuit of the villagers continues. The mercenaries, comparing them to cockroaches, intimidate the civilians and demand something in exchange for their lives. A desperate villager begs for more time, but the mercenaries remain relentless. At that moment, Lewis and Syria arrive at the scene, drawing everyone's attention. Syria orders the mercenaries to stop immediately, reprimanding them for intimidating the villagers. She declares that they will pay for their actions, not by her hands, but by Lewis's. Lewis notices Syria's quick emotional recovery and reflects on her renewed determination. One of the mercenaries recognizes Lewis and mockingly calls him the man of the hour, hinting at a challenge. Lewis tosses a bag to them, stating it's a fine and will change their attitude. The mercenary, with a sarcastic smile, asks if the bag is an advance payment. His tone makes it clear he is well versed in the world of mercenaries, perhaps more than expected. He begins to open the bag, his curious expression mixed with suspicion as he questions how sincere Lewis truly is. The mercenary, with a sharp gaze, looks for any sign of weakness or deceit. Lewis, however, remains calm and composed. He states that he will change their minds, and once that happens, everyone should leave. He makes it clear that there's nothing left to negotiate, as if offering a final chance. But it's the bag's contents that truly capture everyone's attention. Inside lies Maxwell's severed head, a grotesque image that immediately silences the crowd. The princess, visibly shocked and still processing what she's seeing, asks why Lewis was negotiating before the fight even began, questioning if this was why he was marked for death. Lewis, unbothered, replies that he's never been one to crave a fight. If necessary, he'll cross swords, but he doesn't see the need to kill anyone as long as the situation can be resolved another way. For him, the best path is the one that brings the most benefits without bloodshed, choosing wisely. He emphasizes that if lines must be crossed, the sole objective should be survival, making any confrontation a matter of life and death. The princess, still thoughtful, sighs and repeats Lewis's words as if trying to grasp his logic and reflect on her own actions. The mercenary, with a mocking grin, questions whether Lewis really believes a deal like this would work, tossing Maxwell's head to the ground as if distancing himself entirely from the situation. He demands compensation, arguing that even with Maxwell's death, the mercenaries wouldn't simply disband. Without a leader, the group would turn into a band of criminals, bringing serious consequences for everyone involved. He imposes his demand of 10 coins as the price for freeing the villagers, considering it a fair proposal. Lewis, without hesitation, asks if the mercenary really thought he was waiting for this type of negotiation. He already knew these mercenaries would try a final gamble, attempting to exchange the villagers' lives for a sum of money. The princess, with a grave expression, declares that they've now crossed the line, leaving no room for negotiation, and entrusts the mercenaries to Lewis, placing her people's safety in his hands. She reveals that, while she has enough power to handle the situation, she needs to believe that Lewis will do the right thing, as he has proven to be a valuable ally. She asks him not to get hurt during the confrontation. Lewis, with an ironic smile, agrees, responding provocatively that no one ever really cared about that anyway. He, drawing his sword, charges at the mercenaries with swift and lethal movements, taking down dozens of them in the blink of an eye. The mercenary leader, shocked by Lewis's speed, asks how he could be so fast, but is immediately struck by a kick to the face, sending him staggering back, dazed. Lewis continues, unconcerned with the mercenaries' attacks, and states that if anyone posed a real threat, the only option would be death. To him, there was no place for empty threats. He says it's not unusual for a bandit to desire death, but they must understand that this was not the situation the mercenaries were in. If their leader attacked, he would die, and that was an inevitable consequence. The mercenary, struggling to regain his balance, questions Lewis, accusing him of exaggerating. He claims that the Reaper wouldn't make any difference, but soon finds himself on his knees, pleading for forgiveness and begging for a chance to retreat quickly, admitting they had rushed into this and asking Lewis to give them an opportunity. Lewis, with an unshakable calm, lets them go, watching as they leave the scene relieved, but still visibly afraid. Syria, observing the scene, begins to reflect on Lewis's behavior. She realizes that he not only had complete control of the situation but also acted with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what to do. He wasn't merely fighting, he was manipulating the circumstances in his favor, demonstrating the power of his actions. His confidence was evident, and he appeared to act as if he were in command, knowing precisely how to wield his power efficiently. To Syria, this was the image of someone who not only possessed power but knew exactly how to use it. Meanwhile, the princess, who had stepped away to tend to the injured villagers, began to grasp how intense the situation had become. She handed a cloth to an injured villager, instructing him to press it against his wound to stop the bleeding. She explained what he needed to do, directing him to use the cloth to hold the cut area and prevent further complications. However, one villager rebuked her, saying that none of this would have happened if it weren't for her. He questioned her assistance, expressing a restrained anger over everything that had transpired. He seemed unable to understand that the princess was only trying to help, and instead of gratitude, he saw the situation as more complex than it appeared. Another villager, interrupting the conversation, defended the princess, stating that she didn't deserve to be treated that way. He explained that if it weren't for her, all of them would have already been captured and killed by the mercenaries. Despite all the hardships, they were alive thanks to the princess and the knight. To him, the suffering she was enduring didn't justify the hostility from the other villagers. Though they were wounded, they were alive because of her, and that should be enough to show gratitude. Lewis remarked that, in the current circumstances, no one could admit to being a mercenary. The earlier villager apologized to Syria, who said she couldn't blame him for his anger. She acknowledged that all these people were suffering under the royal family of Cetria and urged them to trust her this time and not abandon the country. The villagers replied that her words were admirable, but the mercenaries had already looted the entire town. They couldn't blindly wait for the country to return to normal without even having a place to spend the night. Syria thought that no matter how strong Lewis was, he couldn't protect everyone, and if she had great power. But she quickly dismissed the thought, deciding instead to focus on how to use her abilities to help everyone. She then had an idea. Syria said she knew of a safe place for them and urged them to follow her. The villagers questioned whether they should trust her, and while they understood her desire to help, they couldn't fully believe her. Lewis stated that believing the princess's words or not was an individual judgment, and that was all he could say. If they didn't believe, they wouldn't see how the country under the princess's leadership would change. One villager told the princess that they weren't sure about her yet, but they would have to trust her and follow her. The princess thanked them, saying she would live up to their expectations. Lewis then said he had a question. He asked if the villagers had seen a knight with a scar on the right side of her face. The villager explained that she had been captured by other knights, but as a royal knight, she was probably not killed. Therefore, they first needed to confirm she was alive. The princess looked surprised, but Lewis asked if the princess could have forgotten about Emma. Syria says that, being Emma, she will survive in any situation and that she is not worried because Emma is an extremely resilient knight. In the dungeon, Emma asks if that is all. The prince says he apologizes to Syria because he caused this confusion before the ceremony. Emma asks how this could be the crown prince's fault, but the prince denies it, saying the problem was trusting Caesar's judgment, until Emma notices that the cell bars are slightly loose. Then, she realizes she can open them just by kicking the bars without alerting the guards. The prince questions what Emma is trying now, but she says the security on the bars has been loosened, so they must have over-relied on the ether suppression apparatus and neglected the prison's maintenance. She plans to escape and find Syria. The prince questions what she said about finding Syria, grabbing Emma by the neck. He asks if she was trying to gain the central royalty's authority behind this, and says that Emma is out of her mind, because the prince is the only hope for that country, the only one who should save it by becoming the king of Cetria. A few days earlier, Emma was imprisoned in a dungeon where a hooded man approached to talk. He suggested that the two could join forces to overthrow Josephine, questioning whether Syria really trusted mercenaries that much. Emma confirmed that Syria was seeking that kind of help because she needed allies to strengthen her position. The man hesitated, showing doubt about the princess's strategy, but then revealed himself as the crown prince of Cetria. Confidently, he asked Emma to inform Syria that she didn't need to worry so much about military issues. He had already secured support from civilians and loyal knights, which would be enough to help them overcome the crisis. At that moment, the prince believed they would work together to restore the kingdom's stability. However, the situation had completely changed since then. Now, the same prince seemed like a different person, acting erratically. He showed disdain for any support coming from mercenaries, especially those of humble origins. Emma realized he had lost his lucidity, becoming a shadow of the man she had known before. Worried, she tried to reason with him, insisting that his current behavior didn't reflect who he truly was. The prince, however, seemed to accept his new conduct as the true essence of his personality. He believed he was finally acting according to his desires and saw himself as Cetria's ultimate savior. Emma concluded that his mind had been deeply affected after his capture by Josephine, though she didn't know exactly what had happened. Determined to address the situation, she struck the prince on the neck, knocking him unconscious. Before leaving, she silently apologized, regretting having to leave him outside his cell. The soldiers soon arrived and saw the prince lying on the ground, questioning Emma about what had happened. She explained that she needed to leave and couldn't stay there. The soldiers, following orders, demanded she return to the cell, threatening to subdue her if she resisted. Emma stated that she understood their duty but made it clear she wouldn't return without a fight. Bracing herself for the confrontation, she faced the soldiers as they advanced with their swords. One of them managed to strike her shoulder, but Emma quickly reacted, grabbing the blade with her hand. The soldier warned her about the risk of losing her fingers if she persisted, but she didn't back down. Another soldier took advantage of the distraction and advanced, but Emma used the first soldier's body as a shield to knock him down. Even injured and with one arm practically useless, Emma continued fighting with determination. The soldiers, realizing her resilience, intensified their attacks, but she used her injured arm as an improvised defense. Managing to break free, she struck one of the soldiers with a direct blow to the face. Another attempted to counterattack, but Emma disarmed him, knocking him down and stepping on the arm that held the sword. Exhausted and gravely wounded, Emma fled, aware that she had lost a lot of blood. She feared that, if she continued at this pace, she wouldn't reach Syria in time. As she ran, she wished for Louis's strength, which always seemed unwavering in the face of any challenge. However, her consciousness began to fade, and her vision blurred. Before losing consciousness, she heard a familiar voice criticizing her performance, as a bodyguard and now as a fugitive. Recognizing Caesar's voice, Emma mentally responded, reaffirming that her actions were driven by the promise made to the princess. She wanted to ensure Cetria's well-being above any personal interest. Caesar, seemingly calm, agreed with her view, stating that he too acted for the kingdom's sake. Meanwhile, at the top of the castle, the king of Cetria lamented the kingdom's situation. He considered the challenges faced by the nation, from the constant presence of the mist around the castle to the internal political intrigues. The king was aware of the rebellion the crown prince was planning and the absence of Syria from the palace. He also noticed how the nobility was weakening the queen's position. In the midst of his reflections, Josephine appeared, offering comforting words to the king. She praised him for his love for Cetria and assured him that he had made no mistakes in his leadership. The king, touched by her loyalty, thanked her but questioned if she truly believed that. Josephine reinforced that she would always be by his side, even if the world turned against them both. The king felt relieved by her words, seeing them as a sign of hope. However, Josephine had hidden intentions, planning the kingdom's downfall to achieve her own goals. She pondered how long she should wait to act and wondered if the dragon, the wizard who watched everything from afar, would intervene. The dragon, who was also the royal librarian, considered the finiteness of all kingdoms, seeing Cetria's ruin as inevitable. At that moment, Syria and Louis arrived at the library, accompanied by the rescued villagers. Syria assured them that this place was safe and that they could all rest there in peace. She explained that the library was off-limits to anyone not of the royal family, making it an ideal refuge. The villagers, grateful for the hospitality, began to settle in. Louis, however, questioned the princess about the implications of allowing him and the others into such a sacred place. He suggested that by facilitating access, she was trusting him a lot and asked what she would do if he betrayed her trust. Syria, surprised by the question, tried to respond, but her hesitation was evident. Louis realized that she had not seriously considered the possibility of betrayal. The princess explained that she was offering her trust in advance, as a demonstration of faith in his loyalty. Louis mentioned rumors in the mercenaries' guild about his situation and asked if Syria would be willing to defend him if needed. Before she could respond, Louis had already left, heading towards the dragon. Upon finding the wizard, Louis announced that he was there to finish an unfinished conversation. He called him the Dragon of Cetria, making it clear that he expected answers. The dragon handed a book to Louis. He explained that it was a copy of the books created before the Empire buried that history. He stated that, depending on the messenger, the information could vary. Different perspectives were crucial to understanding the facts. He explained that it would be inconvenient to detail everything one by one, so Louis should read before they spoke. The wizard held a panel, watching the people and commenting that many had made it there. He questioned why Louis brought those types to that place. Louis replied that if the wizard wanted to be a dragon, he should be able to figure that out himself. He also suggested that he could ask them personally, instead of isolating himself in the library. Enraged, the dragon glared at Louis, who thought he seemed weak for dealing with provocations. Observing the villagers, Louis noticed a conversation where they mentioned that the princess had authorized them to enter. He questioned whether it was right for those people to be there. He wondered what kind of trouble was beginning. The villagers were carrying books behind him. One of them patted the dragon's back, telling him not to stand idle and help with the bonfire. The villagers began tearing pages from the books to feed the fire. The dragon, enraged, wondered if they knew the historical value of each book before destroying them. Meanwhile, some peasant women said they had found something good to use as a blanket. He questioned why there were so many things in the place, but no windows. He concluded that it was probably to protect the old texts from sunlight. The wizard reflected that those curtains protected the ancient texts from the deterioration caused by the sun. Sitting at the table, he thought that humans did not appreciate the value of that place. He felt frustrated and wondered if it was normal for them to turn his home into a mess. Syria appeared and asked if the wizard was okay, as he seemed shaken. Upon hearing this, the dragon remembered the past. He mentioned that, just like before, a human had entered his territory without permission. He remembered Syria's ancestor, who had met him. He wondered if he was a real dragon or just a forgotten memory. He answered himself that he was not dead, calling her Little One. The ancestor was surprised and asked if he could really speak. The dragon said that orcs and elves could also communicate with them. He asked why she believed that dragons could not. The girl replied that he could not know that for having met her only that day. The dragon argued that his presence was unknown to humans. He suggests it would be better for her to leave. The ancestor asks why she should and promises not to tell anyone. After some time, the ancestor starts training with a sword. The dragon watches and asks why she trains so exhaustively. She responds that she knows he pretends to ignore her but watches anyway. She says she wants to become strong to protect the weak. The dragon says he understands. Impressed, the girl remarks that he seemed indifferent. The dragon thinks that this was a desire he had heard many times before. After some time, he falls asleep but wakes up upon sensing her presence again. She tells him she is now a knight apprentice, learning ether manipulation. Though it was late for her to begin, she had talent, something the dragon acknowledged. Once again, the girl wakes the dragon and says it's been a long time since they last met. She mentions that this might be their last meeting because she came to say goodbye. The dragon asks why she is saying farewell, as she doesn't seem old enough for that. The ancestor explains that war has spread due to the king's death. Determined, she states she will protect her family, neighbors, and friends. She intends to fight to create a country where her descendants can live in peace. The dragon thinks that this was a reason he had heard many times before. He advises her to prioritize survival over victory. He says it's not shameful to choose to live. Surprised, the girl remarks she didn't expect concern from him. The dragon asks her to leave but laments because he already knew how this story would end. In the war, amidst flames and bodies, the ancestor fights until she hears the dragon's voice. He finds her alive and asks if she knew it would end this way. Standing tall, the girl declares it would be absurd to predict destiny in front of a dragon. She asserts that she will protect her comrades, even if she's the only one fighting until the end. The dragon responds that this is the essence of war. He explains that any justification is used to rationalize violence. The girl asks how many times he has experienced something similar. The dragon says that many began wielding swords for reasons like hers. Years later, the dragon reflects, while in the library, that everything changes with time. From kingdoms to humans themselves, everything passes. He decides there's no need to relive old memories. Syria appears and asks if he wasn't sleeping well. She identifies the book he's reading as the biography of the founding king. Syria remarks that it was her favorite book as a child. She says she read it so much she memorized its contents. The princess says that, just as her ancestor met a dragon, she too could meet one. She recounts searching through various caves, following rumors of dragons in Ceta. She eventually gave up because she couldn't live only in dreams, admitting that, had she studied more, she might be stronger now. Lamenting her weakness, she speaks of her helplessness. The dragon says she already has a lot and shouldn't push herself so desperately. He asks why she doesn't appreciate what she already possesses. He recalls her ancestor, who had the same desire to create a better future. The princess states she wants to prevent people's suffering. Even if it's an unattainable dream, she will fight to make it come true. Sighing, the dragon thinks her lineage is impressive. He wonders if she will remain similar to her ancestor until the end. When Syria asks what he's thinking, the dragon says it was just a thought out loud. However, he warns the princess to be cautious of those around her. He states she can't solve everything alone and that talent is essential to rule. The dragon says that if she truly were a dragon, they would meet again. Meanwhile, Lewis is reading the book. The dragon asks if he hasn't finished yet, which irritates the young man. Lewis replies that he never imagined he'd study so much in that place. He comments on the book's content, saying it feels like a rulebook for a game. The dragon confirms and explains that the book contains memory-sharing magic. Thanks to it, he knows more about Lewis than before. The dragon states he will help Lewis with the main mission but wants something in return. Lewis mocks him, saying a mission involving memory theft wouldn't come cheap. The dragon says a draconic heart would be an appropriate price. Lewis rejects the offer. The dragon says that's strange and asks if Lewis doesn't know the weight a draconic heart carries. He responds that this is precisely why he rejects it, as he knows missions have great rewards proportional to their difficulty. And considering that he walks with a life limiter, he couldn't simply accept this casually. The dragon says that he is cautious, but it's true that difficult missions offer high rewards. Lewis agrees and says it's comfortable to discuss terms like this in this world. The dragon explains that these subquests are intentionally designed with generous rewards to fulfill the main mission. Lewis asks if the dragon is going to help solve the problems of a mere human kingdom. But the mage responds that it's not just a simple human problem, and since Lewis intervened in this world, that kingdom is no longer understood solely by humans. Lewis acknowledges this but asks if the dragon is saying there are others like him on the other side. The dragon says they aren't exactly like him, but they aren't human either. And Queen Josephine is a known demon who has completely vanished from this world. Meanwhile, in the castle, Baanaf and Josephine meet. Josephine questions what made Baanaf come so suddenly. He replies that he came to check on Cetria's situation since it has been a year since the incident, but she is taking too long to dominate a mere human kingdom. Josephine says it was Baanaf who suggested diverting human eyes, and he was the one who failed in the Black Forest yet had the audacity to come to her like this. Baanaf says he was going to ask about the knight who appeared again. Josephine explains that, from the first day, she was on alert but felt no divine power. She asks if Banaf finds him, could she devour him? Banaf replies that killing is the right thing, and she wasn't supposed to contact him until everything was ready. Then disappearing behind her, Josephine begins walking and says everything will be her peace, about the resurrection of the race and so on. She aimed to toy unpleasantly, diligently preparing for the resurrection of the demon god. But she was watching something beyond that. The kingdom there was nothing, but it had a formidable hidden power, a secret for her species. Returning to the conversation, Lewis questions that, considering a dragon living in a library, a demon lord wouldn't be surprising. He also asks what the dragon would gain by challenging such a powerful entity, and whether it would be more appropriate for him to intervene directly. But the mage responds that he doesn't want to get directly involved. He went through the portals and could know this from the media he saw. Lewis says this is his situation. So what would the dragon do if he refused? The dragon replies that, in that case, it can't be helped, as he originally planned to spend his entire life there. But if he dies, Lewis will die too. Lewis questions what kind of nonsense the dragon is talking about. Then the mage asks if Lewis has read the entire book. Lewis replies that he read more than half. The librarian then explains that he must have read about the relationship between gods and races. In this world, mortal races have a symbiotic relationship with the gods. Through this thread of belief, one side thrives while the other grows in power, and so they coexist. And since he is the last dragon in this world, if he dies, Lewis will lose the only race connected to Bahara. Lewis says that he is the last dragon, and he is human, so what does this have to do with him? But he soon remembers Teshua's words, saying Lewis is a human from another world. The dragon says that he has a human body but isn't human, just as he was born of Bahara and was near a dragon but wasn't a dragon. And if Bahara perishes, no one knows what will happen to Lewis. Lewis says that, besides knowing the temple's location, the dragon must defeat the demon lord threatening this kingdom to protect his life. The dragon agrees and says that will be the conclusion. But he questions whether there isn't something suspicious about all this, as it doesn't seem like a mere coincidence that Lewis arrived there after receiving the main mission. It feels orchestrated. He questions why Bahara chose him for a fantasy world like this, and what she wants from him. The dragon responds that he doesn't know the details, but everything Lewis wanted was what Bahara wanted. And it's not because she wants something from him. The reason she brought him to this world was so that he could meet people in an ordinary way, form human connections, believe in others, trust them, support them, and live like that. Lewis approaches Surya, who was sitting. The princess asks if he was planning to leave. Surya recalls the dragon's words to her, telling Lewis that, despite all the problems, she wanted to make a request. However, before finishing, Lewis says he had been waiting and calls her to go find Emma. Since he entered the library first, he wouldn't be dishonorable enough to escape with the payment. He asks if there might be any additional bonus. The princess hugs him and thanks him, saying she will never forget his help. Lewis thinks that surviving will be a bit difficult in such a high-difficulty mission. Leaving the place, standing on a rooftop, he considers that, according to the citizens, Emma had been captured. Even so, there should be skilled knights in the palace. Then, he begins to release ether to see how they would react. As a result, Lewis detects a presence toward the castle. He heads there, thinking it would be easier to take down one opponent after entering. Looking for Emma, he notices traces of blood along the way. The ether reacted there, and the direction was marked. Touching the ground, he finds the blood is not yet dry, and judging by its quantity, it was a serious wound. Heading to a shed, he finds Emma collapsed on the floor, bleeding. Lewis thinks she managed to escape on her own but then tells her to try opening her eyes if she's alive. Emma's breathing is unstable, and her body is cold. She would probably die before reaching the library. Wondering what to do, Lewis considers using the divine power of Maricilla, which would use his own lifespan to heal Emma. Lewis begins to use his divine power, which catches Josephine's attention. She thinks, without a doubt, it was divine power, and Banaf was not wrong. Since such a being truly existed, this becomes increasingly evident, because there stood the knight wielding the power of the gods. Caesar had taken Emma to the top of the castle, observing the distant view with a cold and ruthless expression. He declared that what was about to happen was regrettable. As a noble, he valued the spirit of knights like Emma, but he couldn't ignore the facts. He never imagined she would betray the country she swore to protect, putting everything at risk. Without hesitation, Caesar threw Emma from the top of the tower, claiming it was just a temporary diversion. He explained that this burden was not something a noble could bear for long. It was something that needed correction, even if through brutal means. He also stated that if fate wanted Emma to remain on their side, she would survive. If something like destiny truly existed, this would prove the purity of their cause. Meanwhile, Emma was unconscious, with life slowly slipping away from her body. But then she woke up. She felt her consciousness gradually returning, as if being pulled from a deep abyss. Lewis was beside her, observing her with a relieved yet exhausted expression. He commented that, Even as a skeptic, Maricilla's divine power seemed more versatile than he had imagined. Beyond healing wounds, it could also bring someone back from the brink of death. However, he reflected on the cost, calculating it to be extremely high. 70 hours of life energy to reverse a death. It was something he couldn't simply ignore, a sacrifice requiring careful consideration. He thought that in future situations, he might have to sacrifice other lives to save someone important. Still, at that moment, the most important thing was that Emma was alive. When she finally opened her eyes, Lewis asked if she was conscious. Emma, confused, looked around, trying to understand what had happened. She asked where she was and why her body felt intact as if nothing had happened. Lewis dodged the question, stating that explaining all the details at that moment would be complicated. He then asked if Emma could move. Determined, even feeling her body heavy, Emma stood up. Immediately, she asked about Syria, concerned for the princess's safety. Lewis responded that Syria was safe, hidden in the library along with the others. Before Emma could fully process the information, her eyes widened. She saw Josephine appear behind Lewis, like a silent and menacing shadow. Before she could shout to warn him, Josephine vanished along with him. Emma stood frozen, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Meanwhile, Lewis found himself facing Josephine, feeling the atmosphere around him shift dramatically. There was no doubt that she was not human. Josephine greeted him casually, almost amicably, as if trying to put him at ease. She declared that he was welcome in the royal palace but made it clear that she knew more about him than he realized. She mentioned the incident in the Black Forest, something one of her allies had reported to her. With an almost predatory interest, she asked to see the abilities Lewis had used to defeat the stone-ceiling monster. To test his strength, she appointed Caesar, the leader of the Blue Dragon Cavalry, as his opponent. Lewis responded with sarcasm, suggesting that Josephine should test his abilities directly by putting her own neck on the line. She merely smiled, ignoring the provocation, and explained that the palace had a field that restricted the use of ether. Caesar advanced without hesitation, declaring that he was merely fulfilling his duty as a knight of the royal palace. With a swift move, he attacked Lewis, sending him crashing into the wall. Lewis, frustrated, realized that fighting without ether was nearly impossible. Even without his usual powers, he decided to rely on his swordsmanship, something he had perfected since arriving in that world. However, Caesar seemed to anticipate his movements, dodging his strikes with impressive precision. In a moment of carelessness, Caesar injured Lewis's leg and struck his torso, forcing him to his knees. As Lewis struggled to recover, Caesar mentioned that the technique he was using resembled the Croyd swordsmanship. This skill, Caesar explained, maximized the use of ether but seemed useless under the palace's conditions. Even so, Caesar admitted that he didn't expect Lewis to overcome the ether suppression so easily. Feeling cornered, Lewis began to laugh, surprising Caesar. He explained that he had found two solutions to his predicament. First, he could use divine power through a pact. Lewis activated the pact, initiating a healing process that closed his wounds and restored his strength. Caesar, intrigued, asked how it was possible for a knight to wield divine power. Lewis revealed his second discovery: the residue of divine power transformed into ether. With this energy, he was able to activate the stigma, unleashing an explosive wave that destroyed part of the castle. Outside, Syria, gazing at the sky, heard the blast and remarked that it didn't sound like something caused by a storm. On the battlefield, Caesar had used his shield to protect himself from the explosion but was impressed. He noticed that Lewis had released electricity, an element characteristic of Croyd swordsmanship, even if imperfectly. Lewis, on the other hand, reflected on his position. He had always complained about not receiving special abilities when transported to this world. But now he realized the privileges he had, even if they came with risks. Though the use of the imperfect stigma was dangerous, causing harm to the user's body, he could counteract the effects with the divine power of Maricilla. Determined, he announced that he would show Caesar the true power of Croyd electric swordsmanship. The Croyd sword was more than just a weapon. It represented the emperor's pride and symbolized confidence in his lineage. It was known as the sharpest of blades, its strength not only in its craftsmanship but in the technique that accompanied it. This technique, Croyd swordsmanship, combined physical strength with the maximum potential of ether, perfecting every strike. It was a style that required absolute discipline and exceptional mastery of swordsmanship fundamentals. Aware of the weight of this responsibility, Lewis fought with all his might against Caesar. His strikes were precise, but he knew that the captain's shield was a formidable defense. Any attack that wasn't absolutely perfect would be useless against that barrier. Every move demanded his utmost concentration, as he knew brute force alone would not suffice. The true reputation of Croyd swordsmanship, however, extended beyond its lethality. It incorporated a secret passed down exclusively within the Croyd family, the Croyd family vision. This unique stigma allowed ether to circulate through the body superhumanly, releasing accumulated energy in a single, devastating strike. This power transcended human limits, but carried significant risks for the user's body. With the strike charged with electricity, Lewis unleashed the accumulated power in his sword. The blade sliced through the air like lightning, emitting a deafening roar that echoed throughout the castle. The impact was so destructive that part of the structure collapsed, showcasing the devastating power of the blow. The destruction was so great it seemed like the result of a natural disaster. In another part of the castle, the prince awoke from his unconscious state. Confused, he looked around, trying to understand what was happening. His memories returned slowly, bringing the realization that he had been imprisoned there, and that Emma was also captured. Hearing the soldiers' shouts about the palace roof collapsing, the prince began piecing things together. He wondered if all that destruction could be Sirius's doing, as he knew the princess's power. Meanwhile, Ceta remained steady, analyzing the situation closely. He explained that the behemoth barrier he used operated in a unique way. This shield not only dissipated opponents' attacks but also absorbed their energy and redirected it to the ground, neutralizing their impact. Even so, he couldn't deny that the shield was damaged, which left him perplexed. It was almost impossible to believe that Lewis had achieved such a feat with his destructive power. However, Caesar also noted the cost of this power. He realized that the intense use of ether and divine power was taking a significant toll on Lewis's body. The young man seemed unable to maintain a sequence of attacks without suffering the consequences. Taking advantage of this moment of weakness, Caesar advanced with his sword, delivering a direct strike and hitting Lewis with his shield, sending him flying. Lewis felt the impact with force, his body violently colliding with the wall. He was gasping for air, struggling to stay focused, while Caesar maintained the offensive. The captain knew this was the ideal moment to press the attack. He seized the advantage and attacked again, seeking to end the confrontation. Lewis, however, refused to give up. He knew he needed to survive, not just for himself but for everything at stake. Even facing such a skilled opponent, he continued to fight, searching for an opening to turn the tide. He began to think about his options. If he chose to use Maricilla's healing power, he could recover, but it would temporarily prevent him from accessing ether. On the other hand, using ether meant remaining vulnerable, without time to heal his injuries. It was a difficult choice, but he knew he had to decide quickly. Caesar noticed Lewis's hesitation and increased the intensity of his attacks. He wanted to end the fight before the young man could recover. But Lewis, even amidst adversity, found a new determination. He decided not to rely solely on ether or divine power. He would use every skill he had learned since arriving in this world to win. With a surprising move, Lewis charged at Caesar's shield. The captain initially thought the attack would be ineffective but quickly realized Lewis had something in mind. Instead of trying to break the shield directly, he used his ether skill to concentrate energy on a specific point. The shield, which seemed unbreakable, began to give under the pressure of the strike. Caesar was caught off guard, unable to react in time. The impact shattered the shield, leaving the captain vulnerable for the first time. Without wasting time, Lewis continued his assault. He used the opening to deliver a direct punch to Caesar, breaking part of his armor. The captain was thrown back, feeling the force of the blow like a tremor. Caesar, even stunned, tried to assess the situation. He realized that Lewis was using a unique technique, something that combined Maricilla's power with his own ether abilities. It was a combination he had never seen before, and it intrigued him. Lewis, on the other hand, knew he hadn't won yet. He grabbed his sword and advanced again, determined to finish the fight. Caesar tried to defend himself but was already at a disadvantage. With a downward strike, Lewis finally defeated him. From above, Josephine observed everything with growing interest. She recognized Lewis's potential, especially his ability to combine different types of power. The queen also knew that the use of Croyd electricity was limited, but that didn't diminish her admiration for him. Josephine saw in Lewis not just a powerful warrior, but also a valuable piece in her plans. She knew she could use him for her own purposes, even if it meant manipulating his will. In the library, a villager approached Syria and informed her of someone at the door. This person, a young knight with a visible scar on her face, was looking for her. The princess, without hesitation, ran to the entrance, eager to see who it was. At the door, she found Emma, who immediately grabbed her hand and said it was urgent. Emma began explaining the chaos unfolding in Cetria, detailing how everything was falling apart. Lord Caesar had abandoned the prince, who was now imprisoned. Emma, on the other hand, had managed to escape with the help of the mercenary Lewis, but he was attacked shortly after by Josephine. With a serious expression, Emma insisted that they needed to leave Cetria because the plan was completely destroyed. Syria, with a worried look, asked Emma what would happen to the people who believed in them. She refused to abandon everything, knowing she couldn't simply flee and leave others behind. The princess then posed a difficult question: what would Emma do? as she was the only remaining fighter? Without reinforcements and no military power, a princess without combat skills couldn't do anything. Emma, with a grave expression, suggests they leave the kingdom and wait for a better opportunity. But the villagers, overhearing the conversation, question Syria, asking if she would really abandon everything and everyone. Syria firmly states that she would never abandon her people. She explains that the situation is dire, but the princess would never leave her subjects without a fight. She then emphasizes that, despite everything, they must continue to fight. Emma questions how that would be possible, considering that the princess seemed to be acting very differently now. It wasn't like Syria to act without the help of others, but the situation was beyond what they could handle alone. With a determined look, Syria tells Emma that she believes Louis has not succumbed to Josephine. She believes he would survive because he is stronger than he seems. She has faith that he can fight and win. Emma, though worried, realizes that Syria's confidence is not blind, and she tries to believe in the princess's words. Syria, with a sigh, affirms that they will find Louis again and do everything possible to protect him because he is vital to the future of the kingdom. The princess would not allow their fight to be in vain. Meanwhile, in the castle, Louis stands with his sword pointed at the prince. He questions what the prince truly wants, given the tense situation they're in. If the prince isn't willing to move, Louis advises him to step out of his way. The prince, with a dark tone, asks if Louis was sent by Syria. He tries to make Louis understand that Josephine is not an ordinary person. She uses strange magic to manipulate people, something the prince himself has experienced. Louis, with a piercing gaze, responds that he knows that because he too has recognized Josephine's true nature. She is not human but a demonic creature who uses her abilities to control others. The prince, stunned, admits that he was also a victim of this magic. He feels powerless, as though controlled by something greater than his own will, like being part of a nightmare. With a gesture of understanding, Louis sheathes his sword, questioning whether the prince is truly comfortable being manipulated and acting like a puppet. The prince, with a hollow look, responds that he has no choice. He is a tool in Josephine's hands, fulfilling a mission given to him without questioning its justice or morality. Louis, wasting no time, makes an ironic remark, saying the difference between them is that he refuses to be used unquestioningly. The prince tries to argue, saying his actions are to save the country, but Louis does not share this vision. He questions whether, when the prince or princess takes the throne, they will reject Josephine or become another puppet in her hands. Louis walks away, losing interest in the conversation, and decides it's better to negotiate directly with Josephine. If Caesar truly wanted to stop him, he would have to stand in his way. Louis checks the timer, and realizes time is running out. He knows he can't waste any more time, and despite his limitations, he needs to move forward. He decides to head toward the castle, determined to achieve his goals, undeterred by those opposing him. The prince, with a sorrowful look, questions why Caesar, a hero of the Holy War, abandoned justice to become a tool in Josephine's hands. Caesar responds that he was never a hero but a sinner, someone who participated in a war that was nothing more than a one-sided massacre. He says that no matter how much the prince tries to understand, the reality is that those involved in that conflict were not heroes but people who made difficult and often wrong decisions. Louis, observing the situation, realizes the castle is filled with soldiers, all possessed by Josephine's magic. He recognizes the sorceress's aura and understands the situation is even graver than he had imagined. The soldiers advance to attack Louis, but he doesn't waste time. He imbues his fist with electricity and, with a strike to the ground, knocks down all the enemies around him. Inside the castle, the king is in his quarters, embraced by Josephine. He questions what all the commotion is about, but Josephine, smiling maliciously, says he arrived sooner than expected. When the king asks who the man approaching is, Josephine responds that Louis is a special guest, someone powerful with unusual abilities. She revels in the idea that Louis is the type of man who makes her want more with every moment. The king, consumed by rage and jealousy, grabs his sword and points it at Louis, declaring that he will kill him for deceiving the pure heart of the queen. Louis, observing the king, knows he is being manipulated by Josephine and doesn't even need to check the energy around him to notice it. With a swift motion, Louis delivers a powerful punch to the king, knocking him out instantly. He then turns to Josephine, questioning if this is entertaining for her. Josephine, surprised by Louis's speed, admits she didn't expect him to be so strong. She reveals her curiosity about why he hasn't used the power of Lam yet, and Louis, with an ironic smile, charges toward her. He attempts to strike Josephine, but she effortlessly blocks the attack with an air of disdain. She asks him not to be impatient and, first and foremost, to answer her question. Josephine says she has heard that Louis wields the power of the gods, but what intrigues her most is the stigma he bears, as well as the strange combat maneuvers he employs. Louis, clearly annoyed, complains about Josephine's defense, saying she's only blocking him with the back of her hand. He challenges Josephine to test her own strength, but she, with a cryptic smile, grabs his neck and manipulates him, saying he'll soon be speaking his own words. She questions him about his true desires, fame, power, or health. She wanted to understand what truly drove Louis. With her eyes closed, Josephine declares that Louis has taken the bait. He lowers his sword, and Josephine, with a satisfied smile, touches his chest, saying it's natural for anyone with a high intellect to harbor desires. But with such weak mental strength, he couldn't resist. She begins to wonder if she should call Banaf next. Before she can act, Louis, with a swift movement, delivers a slashing strike that forces Josephine to retreat. The knight now holds the electric sword in his hands, his eyes locked on his target. Louis, with relentless determination, thinks only of killing Josephine. Without hesitation, he charges forward, shouting that he will not fail. He will kill her, no matter what. Josephine, in turn, wonders if her magic isn't working, but she knows that desires are natural for living beings, and this doesn't surprise her much. However, Louis attacking her directly is unusual. With deadly precision, he executes a descending slash on Josephine. She quickly uses powerful magic to try to stop Louis's strike. Nevertheless, he advances even further, breaking through the magic as if it were fragile. Josephine, desperate, realizes she is on the wrong side of a feint. She tries to counterattack, grabbing his arm. But she believes that, no matter who he is, he couldn't escape that magic. In reality, Louis is trapped in Josephine's spell. Her magic, which exploits emotions and desires, managed to reach Louis. With a cruel move, she causes Louis to lose an arm and a leg. This magic, which she uses to dominate minds, is based on exploiting a person's deepest desires. Desire was the point where Josephine could override the will of the body itself, making it her puppet. Whether for love, power, or even health, she manipulated human emotions to make others lose themselves in their desires. But for Louis, his desire was neither lust nor power. Louis's desire was survival. And to survive, he sacrificed an arm without hesitation. This revealed something terrifying within Louis, an obsession with survival that outweighed everything else. Josephine realizes this, and the thought terrifies her. She watches as he uses Marsilla's sacred power to regenerate his lost arm. She thinks to herself that for him to believe he could regenerate like this, his mind could not be sane. For Josephine, this situation was difficult to comprehend. She had always used others' emotions to manipulate their actions, but Louis was different. He was willing to injure himself and even kill others to survive, without hesitation. This obsession with survival made him dangerous and unpredictable. Josephine begins to reflect on what he has become, someone who could be compared to a reaper, immersed in the singularity of his own obsession. Most humans desire survival but live as though death is distant, as if their lives are eternal. But Louis, who had once lived as Minyak, had a very different perspective on death. He knew death was a certainty, and he had prepared for it in a unique way. He was no longer the same as before, and the restrictions he brought with him to this world had made him stronger, but also more dangerous. He carried an invisible timer that extended his lifespan, but only if he killed living things. Because of this, many powerful enemies had appeared, but for Louis, they were both a threat to his life and an opportunity to extend his time further. Josephine, seeing all this, realized that, to Louis, she was now just another presence feeding his survival instincts. She had become someone he needed to kill, and so he continued advancing toward her without hesitation. Meanwhile, the king finally rose, frightened, and asked what on earth was happening. He noticed that Josephine's magic, which had been directed at Louis, was now aimed at him, threatening his life. But unexpectedly, the magic was intercepted by Cesar, who appeared at Louis's side and asked if the king was all right. The king, with a worried expression, asked what had happened to the captain's body. Cesar, with coldness, told him not to worry. As long as the king was safe, nothing else mattered. He then asked the king to leave, saying he would take responsibility for the situation based on his own judgment. Josephine, observing all of this, pondered how to feel when Cesar acted. She noted that although Cesar had moved to defend the king, Louis's movements displayed a rare combat skill. The power of Lam, which granted immense strength to orcs, was clearly influencing Louis. She wondered if this power was a result of divine influence, something she had no control over. However, with a confident smile, Josephine decided that, in the face of Louis, she should undo the charm controlling him. She began to concentrate, attempting to break the spell that had affected Louis. Suddenly, Louis woke up, looking at his hands and asking what had happened. He revealed that he had lost consciousness for a moment, but was soon struck by Josephine's magic. However, Cesar appeared in front of Louis, blocking the blow with impressive strength. Josephine, surprised, questioned what had led Cesar to make this decision. Cesar, with a resolute gaze, replied that he had always followed Josephine's orders blindly as the guardian of the royal family. But when Josephine attacked His Majesty, she lost the right to command him. Now, he would make his judgment, and Josephine would be the traitor to be sentenced. Josephine, with an arrogant smile, laughed and asked how a knight from a small kingdom could judge her. Caesar, with an ironic smile, said it would likely be difficult alone. But he wasn't alone. He had found someone with the same objective, someone who shared the same desire for justice. Since the queen had lost her qualification for the throne, the orders Louis followed from the princess had become justified actions. Now, he knew he had to help Louis defeat Josephine. Louis, looking at Caesar, remarked that he didn't seem like a well-mannered person. He questioned if Caesar wasn't being a lunatic, but admitted that, in this situation, he had made the best choice. Now, they had to continue the hunt for the demon Josephine had become. Josephine called them insects and prepared another spell, her cruel smile reflecting her confidence in her superiority. As she recited the words to invoke the spell, Caesar declared that he would take the lead in the fight against the queen. Louis, observing the tense situation, asked if the behemoth's shield Caesar wielded hadn't been broken earlier during their exchange of blows. Caesar reassured him, saying there was no need to worry about that. He explained that the behemoth's shield didn't rely solely on physical durability, but on the abilities of the one who wielded it. The shield was merely equipment, a tool. The true defense lay in the very essence of the one holding it, and Caesar, with his strength and skill, was the true shield. He charged forward, advancing on Josephine with impressive speed, preparing for a lethal attack. The queen, surprised, admitted she wasn't prepared for this type of situation, but quickly created two magical circles beneath Louis and Caesar. They exploded with devastating force, but even after the explosion, Caesar didn't stop and launched an aerial attack on Josephine. He moved with agility that even the sorceress found surprising, forcing her to retreat slightly. Irritated, Josephine said she thought only she knew how to absorb impacts, but acknowledged that using weight was a good way to deal with them as well. However, she quickly concluded that, given the level of her opponent's strength, her defensive magic was useless. Even so, she cast a spell to defend herself against Caesar, blocking the attack with a magical barrier that appears in front of her. However, while focusing on defending against him, Josephine fails to notice Louis approaching her from behind. With a precise strike, he severs Josephine's head from her body in a brutal cut. Caesar shouts at Louis not to let his guard down, saying it isn't over yet. Before he can finish the sentence, Louis is struck by magical bolts on his shoulders, fired from Josephine's decapitated body. The magic continues to assault him, and Louis tries to defend himself but cannot avoid all the damage. Del Rossi, observing the scene, curses Josephine silently, surprised that she can still move even after losing her head. He should have realized that Josephine's true nature was more dangerous than he imagined. From Josephine's decapitated body, an arm begins to move, and soon the rest of her body regenerates, revealing a demonic and monstrous form. Louis, stunned, questions if this was the queen's true form. Josephine, now in her demonic form, calls them irritating creatures. She admits that she had been insistent on taking over this country, but her original plan had changed. Taking Louis would be easier now, and she was willing to do whatever it took to achieve her goal. At the castle entrance, soldiers heading toward the commotion are intercepted by a mercenary who takes them down with a precise kick. The soldiers, dazed, ask who the creatures the mercenary brought with him are. The mercenary, with a casual smile, responds that a noble among royalty had summoned him. They didn't need to worry because he wouldn't kill them under the princess's orders. He then asks if he will receive his reward, as they had fulfilled their part. Cyrier, watching the scene, assures the mercenary he needn't worry about his reward, as it would be generous in light of his efforts. Meanwhile, Emma, standing beside her, questions the necessity of involving such individuals in the fight. The princess, with a thoughtful expression, responds that she's trying to understand Emma's perspective but also needs to acknowledge the suffering of the people around her. The people were fighting every day, with no end in sight, and that was something she couldn't ignore when making her decisions. The prince interrupts the conversation, urging everyone not to fight anymore. Cyrier recognizes him immediately, and he approaches her with a serious demeanor. The princess asks if he is truly her older brother, whom she thought she had lost. The prince, with a grave tone, explains that Emma had told him about Josephine's magical influence over him, but that wasn't right. They needed to enter the palace together to resolve the situation. Cyrier, confused, asks why. The prince explains that the mercenary she brought is fighting Josephine. Both Cyrier and Emma ask if the mercenary is Louis, and the prince confirms it, saying that despite some misunderstandings during the battle, Caesar and the others managed to defeat her temporarily. Emma is incredulous, and Cyrier, with renewed determination, declares that they will defeat the queen today. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Josephine, in her demonic form, slams her tail onto the ground with colossal force, forcing Louis to jump to avoid the impact. As he lands, Josephine activates a magic circle beneath him, causing an explosion that injures his leg. Louis, feeling the pain, questions what exactly is happening. He realizes it isn't a recently cast spell but rather pre-placed magical mines, traps Josephine had set throughout the castle. He wonders how many attacks Josephine had already prepared, noting that for such a setup, the attacks must be heavily concentrated from above. The intensity of the explosions and the pressure of the battle indicate that Josephine had laid a vast number of magical mines, waiting for the perfect moment to use them. A massive explosion shakes the castle, and chaos ensues. Caesar, witnessing the attack, manages to defend Louis and asks if he is all right. Louis simply thanks him and begins to heal himself with his regenerative blessing, knowing it won't last forever. As Josephine observes with disdain, she questions how long Louis thinks he can last with just a mere shield. She wraps both of them with her tail and, with a cruel smile, declares them irritating insects and that this will be the end of the story. Caesar, realizing the situation is escalating, says it will be risky if they prolong the battle any further. They needed to act quickly, as at that distance, they would only have a chance to counterattack if they acted with precision. He instructed Louis to launch an attack that would cause significant damage as soon as he dropped the shield, since time was running out. Louis, with tension building in his body, responded that he understood. He knew prolonging the fight would be risky, not just for him but for everyone. He had already used his regenerative abilities to their limit, and if he continued fighting this way, he knew his entire life expectancy would be consumed. Therefore, he decided he needed to be decisive. With a charge, Louis slashed Josephine's face, striking her with a powerful blow, thinking that this should be enough to deal her the decisive damage to end the fight once and for all. Louis knew he had only a few minutes left before his resources were completely depleted. With no one else to fall back on, he understood the next strike would be the final one, and he was willing to give everything he had to defeat Josephine. Meanwhile, from the library roof, the dragon watched the battle attentively. He muttered to himself that the mist that once surrounded Cetria had disappeared, indicating Josephine's magic was weakening. If most of her prepared spells had already been consumed, then this was the decisive moment. It was time to use the magic of this world to achieve the final victory. Caesar and Louis advanced against Josephine, who, observing the situation, realized that one side of the battle remained unaffected by her weak attacks, while the other was healing rapidly with the divine power of the knights. She, on the other hand, had used all the spells she had prepared in the castle, originally meant to capture that man. Then Josephine remembered her opponent's allies and, with a laugh, launched a spell that was quickly defended by Caesar. He noted that it was the same technique as before but significantly weaker, showing that she, too, was exhausted. Louis, however, soon realized Josephine had vanished. As he searched, Caesar warned him to be careful when approaching the castle's inner paths, as Josephine might not have given up the fight. Suddenly, Caesar detected a strike coming from above, delivered by a mercenary, but he managed to block the attack with his shield. The captain then realized they were being manipulated, and at that moment, Josephine revealed the truth. She had the power to control everyone in the palace. She, who had been at a disadvantage a moment ago, now held total control of the situation. With a cold smile, she ordered everyone in the palace to attack Caesar and Louis without hesitation. The two, at a disadvantage, found themselves surrounded, but Louis began to think this might be an opportunity. He knew that if he had enough time, he could endure for a long period, perhaps even more than 100 hours, if necessary. Emma then attacked Louis with her sword, and the mercenary, observing the scene, thought about how ruthless Louis was, killing everyone who tried to attack him. However, those attacking them were not acting on their own will. They were mere puppets under Josephine's control. Louis noticed she was preparing to cast another spell and quickly alerted Caesar, who turned to prepare to defend against the attack. But before he could do anything, he was stabbed in the back by a group of soldiers, and with a desperate effort, he slammed his shield against their faces. Already exhausted, Caesar fell to his knees, and Louis, seeing the situation growing increasingly dire, knew he could no longer use both the stigma and divine power simultaneously. He was running out of time, and if the demon continued to stall him, the situation would become even more dangerous. Josephine, with a satisfied smile, remarked that this was a classic method but always effective. Weak humans had no way of breaking resistance, even if their strength was great. She prepared to finish the fight, but then something unusual happened. Josephine's hand began to tremble, and her movements slowed. At that moment, a deep voice echoed, saying that she was still resisting, even in this state, because she was a demon lord. Josephine then identified the presence of the dragon of Cetria, perched atop the castle. Without hesitation, she activated her draconic fear power, a skill capable of instilling primal fear into lower-level entities. She called him a coward for waiting in the shadows for the right moment to reveal himself while she fought alone. The dragon, in turn, said that by returning in this manner, she had broken the mist that shrouded the entire capital, as well as disarmed the traps he had prepared for her. He questioned what he should do with someone who never intended to fight fairly, pointing out that he and Louis had already made a deal regarding Josephine's life. Without wasting any time, Louis charged forward with his sword infused with electrical energy, striking Josephine. As she spat blood, he realized his attack wasn't enough to defeat her, only severing her arm. Josephine, with a look of disdain, commented that he had been disappointing since, after all that, this was the best strike Louis could deliver. She acknowledged that, although Louis had used a great deal of divine power, he was, after all, still human. But Louis, determined, said the sword wasn't finished yet. He had deliberately held back, then released a devastating wave of energy that destroyed the castle floor. The wave caused Louis to fall, and he felt the pain of a broken rib. He questioned why he had gotten so close to Josephine to defeat her, considering the damage he had suffered in the process. However, he quickly realized he hadn't gained any time at all. Josephine stood up again, with a fierce expression, preparing a spell to attack Louis. At the last moment, Syria appeared in front of Louis, taking the spell in his place. Louis, shocked, wondered why she had done that as the princess collapsed before him. Syria, struggling to breathe, explained that she just wanted to help Louis for once. He then recalled something he had been told: if she sacrificed herself to save him, he must carry on. The memory brought a bitter feeling to his heart. Louis, now consumed by a feeling of disgust, reflected on what was happening in his life. He had witnessed countless humans who didn't hesitate to take his life, but the people who truly tried to protect him were few. He had just lost one of those people, and now, with Syria's death before him, his only option was revenge. Even if he died at that moment, he would do everything to destroy Josephine. That was when a voice from the system appeared, informing him that he had invoked the calm of the god of war. Lam, the deity, appeared before him, praising Louis for not losing his spirit in the face of imminent death. Lam declared that this was the true merit of a warrior, someone capable of maintaining composure even in the most desperate situations. Louis, with a look of distrust, questioned if Lam really summoned him in this situation, and whether he was willing to lend his strength. Lam responded that he would grant Louis power, but only if he was willing to pay the price, 1,000 hours of his life expectancy. Louis questioned the steep price, saying it wasn't a funny joke. He couldn't accept that Lam was acting so nonchalantly at such a critical moment. The situation was far too tense for games. Louis asserted that Lam wouldn't appear just to throw a tantrum given the gravity of what they were facing. The mercenary directly asked what the god wanted in return for his help. Lam, with an enigmatic smile, replied that Louis was truly fascinating when angry. He then asked what Louis's conditions were for accepting a contract. With a direct tone, Lam explained that the agreement was simple. Louis only had to give up all the life he gained by killing demons. Louis, outraged, declared that Lam seemed limited in his thinking to propose such an absurd contract. To him, it was as if the god didn't understand that those monsters didn't have long life expectancies. Even so, Louis grabbed Lam's flying dagger, preparing for the inevitable. He activated his blessings, each granting him unique and indispensable powers for the battle. The first blessing drastically reduced the pain Louis felt, allowing him to fight even in extreme situations. The second enhanced his strength and endurance, making him several times more powerful than an ordinary human. The third provided limited wound regeneration, though ineffective for more severe injuries. Finally, the fourth blessing converted all the ether around Louis into divine power, empowering him with the energy of the war god, Lam. Louis, still dissatisfied, remarked that it was obvious Lam was trying to take advantage of him. Even so, he decided to accept the deal, as there was no viable alternative at that moment. Returning to reality, Louis faced Josephine and challenged her directly, commanding her to lose for now. Josephine, intimidated by the strength emanating from Louis, began to doubt her chances of victory. She recognized that this was the same power that had destroyed the sealing stone in the Black Forest. It was beyond her imagination, and Josephine started to question how she could possibly stand a chance against it. She thinks that if she were enchanted or under some magical reinforcement, the situation could have been different. However, the reality was that she was at a complete disadvantage in this battle. Deciding to retreat, Josephine turns to flee, thinking of finding a way to escape from the mercenary. But before she could react, her arm is destroyed by Louis's advance. With a swift and precise move, he cuts Josephine in half, momentarily ending her threat. A magical notification appears in the air, indicating that the demon lord has been destroyed. With this, the timer increases to 9,000 hours. However, due to the pact with Lam, all that time is transferred directly to the god. Louis collapses to the ground, exhausted, as he realizes how cruel that pact truly was. He murmurs that it was a deception that exceeded the limits of imagination. Now, he has only 30 minutes of life remaining, which is not enough time to save himself and the princess. Louis thinks that if they are destined to die, at least one of them should survive. He reflects that for that to happen, someone would need to make a sacrifice. For him, the most important thing at that moment was his own life because he knew he was necessary for future battles. But before he could make any decision, Louis loses consciousness, completely drained. The dragon Jerem approaches Louis, observing him with a look of understanding. He murmurs that he knew things would come to this point. Even with the victory, he recognizes that no one there truly had a happy ending. Jerem says that she, referring to the ancestor, had believed until the end, despite everything. He recalls her questioning how far she would go in regretting trusting people. The ancestor, in her wisdom, had admitted that not regretting it even a little would be a lie. She knew her story would likely be recorded as a noble death, but that didn't make it any less painful. Lacking the energy to continue, Jerem reveals more of his perspective, mentioning that he believed in humans. He states that despite the betrayals and tragedies the world could offer, there would always be someone idealistic enough to make a difference. Jerem acknowledges that this might seem impossible, even in 1,000 years, but he was still willing to watch. He observes the blessing of Myrcilla emanating from Louis's hand, moving to heal Syria. With a smile, Jerem concludes that what the ancestor sought was something exactly like this: hope. Jerem decides to take Louis and Syria to the library, where they could be safe for now. As the dragon flies over the skies of Cetria, the villagers finally spot him. They are awestruck, recognizing that the legend of the dragon of Cetria was real. Everyone stops what they are doing to watch the majestic being flying above them. Another magical notification appears, indicating that Louis's remaining time has decreased to 6 seconds. Then, the timer reaches 0, but instead of disappearing, Louis wakes up in his home. He is eating and confused, asks Emma how he is still alive. Emma, annoyed by the question, replies that she has no idea why he's asking her. Louis comments that it's hard for him to understand what happened. He changes the subject, asking if the mission was over and when he would receive payment. As Emma tries to respond, Cesar knocks on the door, interrupting the conversation. Emma opens the door, greeting him warmly, while Cesar enters with a serious expression. He comments that he understands Louis's hunger since he had been unconscious for 2 days. However, Cesar informs him that His Majesty wishes to meet him to discuss compensation for the mission. Louis, unenthusiastic, asks if that's all and gets up slowly. Cesar, already outside, says he will wait and asks Louis to hurry. Emma takes the opportunity to ask Cesar something. She mentions that she heard about him abandoning the prince earlier, and how he resisted temptation. Emma admits that while it's hard for her to understand, she knows Cesar isn't driven by greed. She praises his choice, saying he made the right decision. Cesar listens in silence, reflecting on his actions and their consequences. He finally asks if it was truly the right thing to do or if it was too early to say so. Emma, confused, asks if she misheard. Cesar avoids the topic, suggesting she's imagining things. He changes focus, asking why Louis still isn't outside. Emma, concerned, opens the door again but realizes Louis had already left. The mercenary was wandering the streets, reflecting on the recent experience. Louis mutters to himself that it would have been bad if the king offered the compensation directly. In the streets, the villagers discuss what happened, many complaining about the fact that the king had been manipulated by demons. Even so, the villagers claim that their lives likely wouldn't change that much. Louis sighs, acknowledging that they were right. He reflects on how humanity in that world, despite its history of wars and development, is still plagued by social problems. Arriving at the library, Louis observes the mess and sarcastically notes that everyone left without cleaning up. The dragon Jerem, still present, remarks that, unlike Louis's world, ordinary people in this place don't have the luxury of valuing knowledge. For them, surviving day by day is more important than anything else. Louis, surprised, asks the dragon if he isn't dead. Then, he concludes himself that Jerem should already be dead, considering what had happened. Jerem agrees, saying he is now just a fragment of consciousness. He mentions that his heart served Louis well during the battle. Louis comments that, despite everything, not only is he alive, but his lifespan has also been extended. Jerem explains that this was the result of the sacrifice he, the dragon, had made. Curious, Louis asks why Jerem made such a sacrifice. Jerem, with a mysterious air, replies that it's a long story, promising to tell it while Louis can see it for himself. With a magical gesture, Jerem assumes his draconic form once more, revealing his full majesty. Louis, impressed, remarks that this is the dragon's true appearance. Jerem responds that it is an illusion manifested by his mind but also his true form. With a respectful tone, Jerem says it is an honor to meet the bearer of his heart. If Louis wants to understand why Jerem acted as he did, it would be simpler to directly access the dragon's memories. Suddenly, Louis is overwhelmed by Jerem's memories. Through the dragon's eyes, he sees countless civilizations rise and fall over the years. Over time, Jerem began to believe that the only constant was the emptiness that emerged at the end of everything. A friend he had in ancient times mentioned that this emptiness was merely part of a larger process, something she called growth. Ironically, Jerem's friend eventually succumbed to history, losing her life in the course of events. It was then that Jerem decided he wanted to prove, without intervention, what she had said while she was alive. Yet, after witnessing so many failures and collapses, he felt any attempt was futile. Louis, intrigued, questioned why Jerem limited himself to observing instead of directly intervening in events. Jerem explained that, from the beginning, he had always been the observer type. He said this became clearer from the moment he met Louis, and it was then that his perspective on everything began to change. Louis, in turn, expressed that it was late to talk about this but felt enormous gratitude for Jerem saving him. Jerem responded that true gratitude isn't expressed only in words but through actions. He then used magic to return to his humanoid form. With this, Jerem explained that, if Louis hadn't appeared, the dragon would have spent countless days in Ceta, trying to prove a hopeless point. He thanked Louis for showing him what he had been waiting for. Louis, reflecting on everything, began to realize that it wasn't about proving his friend wrong. In fact, she had been right all along. Jerem wanted to see it for himself, but he wasn't trying to change the course of things. It was then that Jerem revealed his consciousness was dissipating. He said that once fully assimilated, Louis's mission would be updated and asked him not to focus solely on immediate survival but to look beyond the mission ahead of him. Before disappearing, Jerem stated that life wasn't just a mission to complete but a journey full of other meanings. As he faded away, Jerem left Louis with one final message, that he should live more fully, focusing less on responsibilities and more on purpose. Emma then found Louis, asking why he had disappeared without saying a word. Louis apologized, explaining that he needed a moment for himself. He asked if they should move forward, but Emma requested just a 5-minute break. In the castle, Caesar spoke with the king, questioning if he was serious about certain decisions. He said those matters shouldn't be treated lightly. The king, surprised, replied that he never imagined hearing such words from Caesar. The commander, however, explained that the situation was complicated, both on a personal and national level. He mentioned the Croyd family stigma and the fact that Louis bore the stigma of Croyd swordsmanship, which made his true identity more complex than it appeared at first glance. But the king, indifferent, replied that it didn't matter. What mattered was the fact that Louis had used a false identity during the crisis, without associating himself with his lineage. What mattered were his actions, not his past. The king emphasized that Louis had appeared at a critical moment, faced powerful demons, and saved Cetria. That is what truly mattered. Caesar listened in silence as the king continued, saying the kingdom needed hope, and for that, a hero was essential. He added that perhaps he hadn't understood this before, but now Louis should. The king stated that this was the responsibility of the royal lineage. Caesar then agreed, acknowledging that it was time to grow up, as they could no longer wait for a hero. The kingdom couldn't sustain itself by waiting for a savior, it had to move forward. When Louis arrived, the king welcomed him with great praise, highlighting the integrity and dignity he had shown through his actions. As a token of gratitude, Louis was offered a carriage, health, and several chests of gold. However, Louis politely declined. The king, surprised, asked why he wouldn't accept the gifts. Louis explained that, as a mercenary, he didn't need titles or land, and carrying all that wealth would make his travels too slow and cumbersome. The king was perplexed but respected Louis's decision. He then asked if Louis was leaving, to which the mercenary confirmed, saying he had fulfilled his mission in Cetria. However, as a member of his mercenary guild, he still had some obligations to fulfill. It was then that Louis noticed a golden sword among the treasures. He decided to take it, saying his sword was broken and that it could be a good replacement. The king permitted it without hesitation. Caesar, however, intervened, saying that Louis should leave that sword behind. Louis, confused, asked why he couldn't take it. Caesar, with a more serious tone, explained that the sword wasn't the one Louis needed. Louis clarified that his sword had broken during the last battle. Caesar suggested he go to the forge and take a simpler sword, but he warned that this particular sword had significant meaning. It was a relic received from a dragon, a close friend of the kingdom's founder. It symbolized the authority of the royal family and was used in important ceremonies. Caesar stressed that the sword should never be unsheathed within the kingdom. When Louis drew the sword, it shone with a golden light, surprising everyone. Caesar, alarmed, insisted that he shouldn't use it at that moment, as the sword held sacred meaning. Louis jokingly said he would only draw the sword again when Caesar stopped questioning him about it. He mentioned that he hadn't decided when to leave Cetria but that it would happen in a few days. Cesar was about to say something, but Louis interrupted, stating he would think about it later. At that moment, he noticed Syria watching from a distance, and commented that she had probably overheard the conversation but wouldn't care about the sword's significance. Syria, seemingly indifferent, banged her head against the wall in frustration. That night, Louis thought he had rested enough. With Marcilla's blessing, he was fully recovered, but he still felt discomfort in his chest. He wondered if it could be related to the dragon's heart now beating within him. Emma appeared and asked if he really planned to sleep there instead of staying at the royal palace. Louis replied that he preferred not to stay at the palace in case the king decided to organize a farewell banquet. Emma remarked that, given the king's personality, that was to be expected. Louis then joked, saying the sword was perfect for a mercenary. Emma, curious, asked if he was training right after recovering. Louis responded that he felt much better but needed time to get used to the sword. Emma questioned what was wrong with the sword, as it seemed to glow in golden hues. As Louis thought more about it, he recalled Commander Cesar mentioning something about the golden sword, a symbolic gift with a golden light. The sword hadn't shone like that until now. He began to wonder why the glow had appeared at this moment. The system issued a notification stating that the dragon's golden sword, now glowing with golden light, had been given to the dragon's chosen one by the first king of Cetria. Louis then reflected on why these notifications were appearing now. Could Marcilla's influence in restoring the system somehow be causing this? However, he realized that these types of messages only appeared with special items. Other weapons didn't trigger this reaction, confirming that the sword indeed held unique significance. He sheathes his sword and turns to Emma, deciding that the training could wait. Something else had caught his attention, and he needed to understand it better. Emma, surprised, asks what happened. Louis responds that she hadn't come there just for a duel but also to tell him something important. Emma admits she was caught off guard and confesses that she came to express her gratitude. Louis then questions if he was truly worthy of such appreciation. Emma, with a serious expression, reveals that she couldn't protect herself or her master. Louis, however, not only saved her life but also the country. She feels indebted to him for his help. Louis, with a thoughtful look, asks what really happened during his fight with Josephine. Emma explains that while he was fighting, she was trying to help the princess escape the country. Louis, still not fully understanding, questions what was wrong with trying to escape such a complicated situation. After all, he himself had wished to flee on countless occasions. Ironically, the princess had the same thought. However, what truly surprised Louis was that, in the midst of the fight, the princess tried to escape, jumping away. Louis advises Emma to be more careful in the future to avoid such incidents since she was responsible for the princess's protection. He then teases her, jokingly asking if Emma was trying to trap someone there to work forever. She responds with a smile and a sigh, knowing he was lightly teasing her. Louis, curious, asks where the princess is. Emma replies that she is busy dealing with state affairs, trying to gain experience. Syria, the princess, complains that it feels like the work never ends. She asks her butler for a brief moment of rest, but he responds that she had already taken the whole day off the day before. If she wanted to finish most of today's work, she would need to be ready to inspect the city soon. Syria, lost in her thoughts, begins to ponder this, reflecting on the butler's words and what would be necessary to do next. Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.